Chapter 825. Underground in the abyss, after the ice layer fell off, the dark artificial buildings around gradually became clear. On the smooth obsidian wall, a platinum light was extending along the notches, and soon the entire corridor was lit up. Alaz and Medisha walked curiously along the corridor, but the two had been lost for a long time. "We seem to have been walking in circles, Sister Alaz." The little female dragon's face turned red, but she held the star-shaped stone in one hand and waved her claws, showing her little fangs, and said, "How is that possible? You must have remembered wrongly." Medisha smiled. "Yes," she nodded and smiled. "Just like in the wild of the Four Realms, the reason why we haven't reached our destination is because we are walking too slowly." Alaz seemed to have been electrocuted. She turned around and stared at Medisha with wide eyes. You, how did you know?" "I also know that you were the youngest dragon on the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints, Sister Alaz. In Moros you snuck out on a date with Lord Flora, and were caught by the Wind Elf guards, and Lord Eloranta gave you a good scolding." Medisha whispered, "Do you remember what she said at the time? How can you get lost on a tryst? How can my subordinates be so much worse than Gretel and Saint Tassel? How embarrassing, get lost." The little fairy princess imitated the scene vividly. Alaz opened her mouth slightly like a puppy showing her sharp fangs. Her face was like a ripe apple. "Impossible, how could anyone know about this? You, who are you?" Medisha tilted her head, smiled and did not answer. Alaz suddenly screamed. She looked at her with some surprise. "I remember, it's you, little Princess Crescent. Why did you change your name to such a strange one?" "That's my surname, Sister Alaz." Medisha sighed. "My real name is Medisha." The little female dragon stuck out her tongue and replied with some annoyance, "You look different." Medisha touched her forehead. "Sister Alaz, I am a heroic spirit, my appearance will not change." "Is that so?" Alaz scratched her round cheeks. "Then I probably remembered wrongly." "So let me lead the way," Medisha replied, "just like when we worked together before, okay?" But Alaz did not answer. Instead, she raised a finger and pressed it against Medissa's lips. "Shoo," she said. "Do you hear something?" Medissa was shocked and quickly took a small step back, glaring at her. "It's true, there's a sound." The little female dragon quickly replied. "Really?" The silver elf princess raised her eyebrows slightly. She knew that the five senses of the golden race were much more sensitive than other races, but suddenly her pointed ears twitched. Both of them turned their heads in a certain direction at the same time. Over there was a crossroad in the long corridor, and a battered figure was limping slowly from there. After a while, Alaz and Medisha emerged from the invisibility spell. "That guy looks familiar." The little female dragon bared her teeth, suspicious. "It's Dukarek," Medisha replied. She and Alaz looked at each other. The white beam of light pierced through heaven and earth. Maynard and the others turned their heads and stared in that direction from afar. The second time, Veronica looked angrily at Ko Hua as another image in front of her was drowned in the white light. Levas, the border city of Cruz, had been reduced to ashes. She was so angry that she almost crushed the hilt of her sword, but Brando held on tightly to the female army commander, afraid that she would lose her mind. The three of them had launched many attacks on Ko Hua, but they had all failed. The divine barrier was like a wall of despair, lying between the mortals and the gods. There was no way to break through. Ko Hua turned her gaze to the next image, Oskin, a city of wind elves. Brando looked nervously at the rapidly changing images. There were still two more images, and below them was the beautiful castle by Lake Kirkle. He was so nervous that his palms were sweating. How could there be such a battle? I have to think of a way. At this time, Ko Hua suddenly looked up as if looking at something. Her voice echoed on the platform again. "Sister, you're here." Brando was slightly startled. He turned around and saw the figures of the young prince and Prince Lenoret appear on the cliff. "Teacher. Lady Veronica." His and Shido's voices were the first to be heard, and then Brando saw another Ko Hua appear behind them. In the middle of the hall, Ko Hua's dark side frowned, while the kind Ko Hua just nodded gently. Could the key to the battle be the kind Ko Hua? This thought flashed through Brando's mind. "She is?" Mephistopheles asked. "That is also Ko Hua, and the one controlling Milos is her dark soul." "Two sides of one?" Brando nodded. "Something like that." "Oh, wait." He was surprised to see that Veronica had already charged in that direction. Obviously, this female army commander had thought of the same thing, but the problem was that Veronica was much more decisive than he was. But by the time he reacted, the tip of Veronica's sword was almost in front of Ko Hua. The kind Ko Hua was almost stunned. Her eyes widened and she just stood there in a daze, not understanding why this human woman attacked her indiscriminately as soon as she saw her. Of course, even if she was not stunned, she might not be able to dodge Veronica's sword. After all, one was a spellcaster and the other was a warrior. In close combat there was no comparison at all. Ko Hua opened her mouth slightly, and just as Veronica's sword was about to pierce through her heart, Brando's anxious shout finally came. Stop her. Without hesitation, the young prince unsheathed his sword to block Veronica's attack. However, Veronica did not even spare him a glance. The gap between the two of them was simply not on the same level. Just as the young prince unsheathed his sword, he felt a gentle force on his hand. Before he could react, his sword flew out of his hand and stabbed into the ceiling of the cave. But it was only a slight delay, and the kind Korfa finally reacted. She let out a low cry and fell on her but on the ground in fright. Veronica's cyan sword aura flew over Ko Hua's head, only cutting off a few strands of hair. She frowned and prepared to attack again, but at this moment, Ko Hua's dark attack finally arrived. How dare you? The dark Ko Hua's voice rumbled and a white electric whip lashed out at Veronica. Veronica did not dare to block it directly, so she could only lean to the side and let the electric whip hit the cliff, cutting off a table-sized fragment from the solid wall. And with this delay, Veronica finally lost the chance to continue attacking the kind Ko Hua. She could not help but turn around and glare at Brando. But Brando only felt relieved. In fact, he had already thought it through. The key to this battle was definitely not Ko Hua. Ko Hua came to this platform because of him and the young prince. The key to this battle was definitely not a factor that could only appear on the battlefield. In other words, if Ko Hua did not appear, there would be no way to fight this battle? This was obviously illogical. He hurriedly gestured to Veronica, indicating that he had something to explain. But at this moment, Brando saw the fragment that Ko Hua's electric whip had swept down behind Veronica tumbling down. It hit one of the energy transmission pipes and with a crack, the pipe caved in. The pipe immediately flashed and the light on it was quickly extinguished. Seeing this, Brando's heart skipped a beat. I know, so it's here. He immediately looked up and shouted to Mephisto and Veronica, "Attack the platform! Attack those pipes!" The Ash Sword Saint and Veronica were slightly stunned and looked at him with some confusion. Clearly they did not understand for a moment. Brando was so anxious that he could not help but shout, Ko Hua is just a false god. She has no divine power barrier at all. The absolute difference in her body comes from Milo's. Her power comes from this platform. Right now, she has not completely merged with Milo's body. It will be fine as long as she is cut off from the platform. As soon as Brando's voice fell, dark Ko Hua, who was above the platform, changed her expression. Don't joke around, you guessed wrong, she hurriedly defended herself. Veronica and Mephisto looked at each other and immediately flew to the left and right sides of the energy transmission network scattered to the left and right sides of the platform. With a few flashes of sword light, dozens of energy transmission pipes were cut in the middle. The disordered magic flow formed a pulse like a nova explosion. In the blink of an eye, several huge holes were blasted in the dense network. Damn it! Ko Hua screamed. She could no longer maintain her calm. She raised her hands and countless lightning bolts appeared out of thin air on the platform, like raindrops striking toward Brando, Mephisto, and Veronica. Mephisto and Veronica were fine. They could deal with these lightning attacks with a little distraction, but Brando was in a bit of trouble. It seemed that the other party was retaliating against him for finding out that weakness. Almost half of the lightning bolts were aimed at him. He only blocked 2 or 3 before the fourth hit him directly. His body went numb and he was immediately bathed in the lightning storm. If it were not for his ridiculously high will, he would probably have been sent to see Martha directly. But even so, the dense lightning bolts still took away almost 2/3 of his HP. More importantly, his clothes were now like that of a beggar's. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that this AoE attack should be shared by everyone in the party. But now there were only 3 of them in the party, and Ko Hua saw him as the number 1 target. He could only blame himself for being unlucky. After the lightning storm, Veronica and Mephisto launched another attack. But this time Ko Hua was smarter. She simply gave up on attacking altogether. Instead, she channeled all her energy into the ground and supported a strong protective shield over the pipes. In the beginning, Brando could cut through several pipes with a single slash. But after Ko Hua cast the shield, she might not be able to cut through even one pipe. He looked back and saw that the progress of Veronica and Mephisto had been greatly reduced. However, Brando felt that Ko Hua's brain was probably a little off. Although she did greatly slow them down, the problem was that if she did not attack, the pipes would be cut through one by one. Of course, Brando was happy to see the boss being stupid. No one would complain that their boss battle was too easy. Besides, he vaguely felt that the problem was not that simple. Please wait a moment. Scarlet heard the voice behind her and turned back. She glanced at the young man who had caught up from behind. She remembered that he seemed to have introduced himself as Babarn or something else. The name sounded a little strange to her. Erwin rarely had such a name, so she had a deeper impression of it. The young man ran, panting. He probably had something urgent to attend to. The Highlander girl stared at him blankly. After a while, she remembered that she should be the one asking the question. What is it? Beautiful lady, I still don't know your name. Scarlet frowned. What does my name have to do with you? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to thank you. The young man replied breathlessly. He faintly felt the hostility of the other party. He was a little surprised but immediately added. Thank me? Yes, thank you for saving us. I can't not repay you for saving my life. Scarlet thought for a moment. Babarn seemed a little nervous. He did not know why, but he always felt that he could not move freely in front of the other party. At first, he thought that it was because the other party was too much to his liking. But after spending some time together, he began to gradually feel that there seemed to be a strange temperament in the other party, faintly exuding a frightening aura. Of course, he did not know that the blood of the dragon and the thunder god flowed in Scarlet's body at the same time. He vaguely felt that the Countess's handmaiden was a little unusual. He suddenly felt a little nervous and began to regret that he should not have agreed to work with those guys. At this time, Scarlet finally recovered from her daze. She looked up at the surrounding cliffs and asked as if she was referring to something. You said that you want to thank me. Is this how you thank me? The young man was slightly stunned. But Scarlet had already picked up the halberd in her hand and pointed in all directions of the underground glacier. These rats hiding in the corner, are they your companions? Babarn's face changed. At the same time, the faces of the noble soldiers who were pointed out by the mountain girl did not look good. They awkwardly walked out from the shadows around them and looked at the girl with some surprise. Only the leader from before clapped and praised dryly. This is really beyond our expectations. I didn't expect the young lady to be a real master. Scarlet looked at these people quietly and frowned. But she was secretly prepared to be on guard. After all, she was a mercenary. Just by looking at the position of these people, she knew that they did not come with good intentions. Don't worry, the man continued. We do want to thank the young lady. We hope that the young lady will come with us to cruise as a guest. The Empire has always been hospitable. We will definitely treat you well. Babarn quickly nodded. Yes, we won't embarrass you. We just want to ask you for a favor. A favor? Yes, beautiful lady. If you agree, I will personally ask His Majesty to restore your freedom. You will become a free citizen of Cruz. You will not have to bow down to anyone. Besides, with your ability, it is not impossible for you to become a noble of the Empire. Babarn explained. But never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he had said something wrong. In fact, just as he finished saying that he would let her regain her freedom, he saw that the eyes of the seemingly innocent mountain girl had already revealed a ferocious glint like that of a wild beast. Chapter 826. Kurobo, the outskirts of Y-Town. Kurobo Church wasn't the most majestic church in the entire White City area. After the Year of the Wilderness, the Year of the Jade Forest, and the Year of the Croaking Frogs, the three cathedrals of Kurovi, Ajrian, and Babalissa were completed. It became even more obscure. But in terms of history, this church that sat on a mound and weathered by wind and rain was one of the oldest pilgrimages in the 10 cities area. Its priest, Father Salian, was one of Bishop Byland's proudest disciples. However, this branch of the Mensa sect didn't pursue fame and fortune, so it was gradually forgotten. The outskirts of Y-Town were stormy. In the church, on the podium behind the altar, a dark-skinned priest who looked like an old farmer stared blankly at the holy water cup in front of him. The holy water chalice was a gift from Farnazane. The silver holy water chalice was filled with holy water that was filled with magic. It was said that the filthy could see their sins in the reflection of the water, the greedy could see their own ugly desires, the devout could see their firm hope, but only the pure could see the oracle from above the clouds. Although it was just a legend, the holy water cup was indeed the most sacred vessel in a pilgrimage place. It was also one of the fixed ritual props used in the most solemn ceremonies. The farmers and the poor would occasionally ask for some holy water from the church. It was said that it had healing properties, and Father Salian was willing to give it to them. But at this moment, the thunder rumbled and the surface of the holy water cup rippled. A layer of black fog seemed to float on the surface of the water. One after another, golden words appeared in the black fog and gradually disappeared. This strange scene had lasted for a full quarter of an hour. Father Salian's forehead was full of cold sweat. He kept drawing sacred symbols on his chest and reciting hymns. However, the thunderstorm outside the window seemed to be even more violent. From time to time, the shouts of monks and apprentices could be heard from outside the church. Not long after, an ascetic drenched in water rushed in from the side door with a scripture wrapped in oiled leather. "Father, the scripture has been hidden in the cellar. This rain is strange. The demonic wave this time seems to be much bigger than the previous ones." He suddenly stopped talking when he saw Father Salian turn around with a pale face. "Father? Quick, go inform Bishop Gonzalez. Tell him to inform the Bugis." "Inform the Bugis? What happened, Sir Priest?" The cultivator's expression changed greatly. "Get the Bugis to shut down the monitoring station in the elemental frontier." Salian's hand trembled as if he was crazy, and his voice sounded like it came from the depths of hell. "The constellation of Milos has been restored, a god has been resurrected in Wound." A thunderclap fell. The buzzing sound echoed in the church for a long time. The ascetic stood dumbfounded in the middle of the aisle between the 3 rows of chairs, forgetting what he was supposed to do for a moment. Go quickly. I need to see the great sage." Salien shivered and looked out of the window. The wind and rain continued to weave. Shallow Water Town. After the 8th month, the eastern part of Lantern Island finally showed signs of greenery. The forest was no longer lifeless with withered branches and withered leaves. Rustling sounds could be heard when the wind from Lake Kirkle swept through the forest. 2 young men were fishing on the pier by the lake with a sand bucket by their feet. One of them was yelling as if he did not care that he had scared away his prey. "Hey Lando, I'm sure I'll catch a pike today. Let's go make fun of John and the others." "Shut up, you're scaring the fish away." His companion reprimanded him impatiently. "Don't worry, now's not the time to take the bait. I'll be quiet later. But the wind today is a little too strong, it won't be easy to reel in the rod." The first young man held his head with both hands and leaned against the wooden pillar of the pier, muttering as he chewed on a blade of grass. "Can you just shut up?" Before the second young man could finish his sentence, the entire pier shook as if there was an earthquake. He bit his tongue and could not help but scream. The first young man jumped up and looked around in shock. Finally, his gaze fell on the surface of the lake. In his field of vision, a conspicuous ripple was spreading along the shore towards the center of the lake. That was definitely not a reverse wave. "Hey, what's going on? Did the ground move just now? Damn it. My tongue. It hurts." The young man called Lando was hunched over on the pier. He was in so much pain that he looked like a cooked shrimp. The first young man stood up cautiously. He felt that something was wrong. He looked up. It was the forest. The forest had quieted down. Then a buzzing sound came from the north. It sounded like the bees in old John's house, but he knew that it was not bees. There could not be so many of them. He looked up instinctively and saw a dark cloud coming from the direction of the Deathfrost forest. Something big happened. The young man immediately remembered the group of nobles who entered the forest half a month ago. Without a second thought, he grabbed his companion from the bridge and ran towards the lakeside. It was at that moment that the second shockwave arrived. From afar, the ground in the forest seemed to be rippling, and the soil that was pushed up by the shockwave swept across the entire northern shore of Lake Kirkle like a wave. The young man had just dragged his companion to the lakeside when he saw the shockwave. He could not help but cry out as he leaped from the bridge and landed firmly on the beach not far away. Behind him, the shockwave was like a whip, whipping the bridge. The bridge that had stood by the lake for 15 years in Shallow Water Town trembled as if it was suffering from typhoid fever. In just a moment, it completely fell apart with a crash, turning into a pile of broken wood floating on the surface of the water. The young man looked at the scene with his mouth agape. There was only one thought in his mind. What's going on? The White Gorge had disappeared. The glacial valleys were melting, and the accumulated snow was collapsing and collapsing. The mountain ranges were fragmented and shattered, and the mountain peaks sank into the ground, leaving behind terrifying cracks. The earth rumbled and the trembling mountains sang a hymn. The ice layer collapsed layer by layer amidst the song, and a glacier half the size of a town tumbled into a bottomless abyss. It dismembered in the process, making thunderous sounds. The young knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment stared at the scene in front of them with their mouths agape. The entire canyon had been flattened, and the glaciers on both sides were disappearing like sand in an hourglass. From time to time, someone would lose his footing in the falling snow. The people on both sides hurriedly grabbed him and dragged him up. Aaliyah was shaking off the snow in his hood. He looked up at the doomsday-like scene, and could not help but feel a little lost. Marcia above, what's going on, Brund? When did you blaspheme the gods and now you're being punished by the heavens? Shut your stinking mouth. Brund coughed angrily on the stretcher. Maynold walked at the front of the team. She climbed up a cliff, then reached back and let little Pero grab her hand and climb up. Thank you. The latter shook the snow off his bearskin coat and thanked her. We can't go any further. What's wrong? Look ahead. Someone in the team suddenly shouted. Little Pero narrowed his eyes and looked ahead with his hand on his eyebrows. Straight ahead, the white gorge had completely disappeared and was replaced by a deep valley. Below the deep valley, the pervasive ice fog was gradually dissipating, revealing an endless black complex of buildings behind. Right below their feet, it looked like stacked obsidian cubes, but each of them was more than tens of thousands of feet long. The mist shrouded these majestic cubes, and at a glance, it looked like the legendary Titan's Ark. At this moment, the glacier was disappearing downward, and these black buildings were slowly rising in the rumbling roar. Martha above, what the hell is this? Aaliyah's eyes widened as he looked at the slowly rising black wall. Maynold watched quietly, and those strange yet familiar memories seemed to emerge automatically in her mind. Little Pero turned his head to look at her. Madame Maynold? Retreat. The retreat has long been cut off. Little Pero pointed to the high black wall and asked loudly, Madame Maynold, do you know something? Maynold turned back and stared at the short knight of Cruz with her dark eyes. She did not say a word, but it made the other party flinch. Little Pero understood the danger and warning in her eyes, and he took a step back subconsciously. This move immediately made him blush. He was about to speak but was interrupted by Maynold. You want to know what that is? Without giving Little Pero a chance to speak, Maynold opened her mouth and mouthed 3 words. Milos. All the energy pipes had lit up, and the platform was slowly rising with a humming sound. The darkness faded like a layer of gauze, and light sprinkled down from above, gradually outlining the edge of the entire abyss. On the smooth broken wall, there were countless crystal lattices that transmitted energy. Some of them were in regular lines and some were in beautiful circles. The entire wall was like an enormous machine. Every part of it was operating in an orderly manner. The platform slowly rose to the center of this space before it stopped with a buzzing sound. Ko Hua was in the center of the platform, and only then did she slowly raise her eyelids. At this moment, the black flames on her body had already scattered like falling leaves, revealing the platinum-colored body made of pure lightning below. She opened her eyes and they were snow-white. Arcs of lightning jumped from her arched face and extended to her slender neck. Her hair was purely composed of lightning bundles bound together. Feels good to be reborn. There seemed to be 2 voices echoing on the platform. One belonged to Ko Hua and the other was rolling like thunder. The 2 voices gradually overlapped and merged into one. Just as Ko Hua opened her mouth, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky, passed through her body and hit the platform below. Countless ionized particles exploded on the obsidian-like platform like splashes of molten steel, and poured into the deep engravings on the platform. Streaks of platinum-colored light extended in all directions along the ancient patterns, and in an instant, the entire platform seemed to have come alive. The glowing energy pipes refracted beams of holographic projections into the air. In these projections the ancient runes flashed, Flame, Oss, Aaron. These runes flowed down like rain, forming beautiful data streams and light walls. Brando was almost shocked by this scene, until Ko Hua's voice sounded again. The dispute from thousands of years ago seems to still linger in the hall above the clouds. The sad gods have to admit their failure. They have planned a future that is almost certain to be destroyed for the world you call Wand. They are about to return fate to you lowly creatures. Thousands of years later, you've defeated the dusk, but chaos has taken root in your hearts. Greed, sin, slaughter, and endless conquest, you've turned yourselves into the apocalypse that you once saw in the prophecy. The classical order has become a thing of the past. Only entropy exists forever. Today the gods have once again awakened you. Everything is back to square one. The world was born from chaos and was destroyed by chaos. Reality and prophecy are confirmed one by one. Mortals, this is your recompense. Then her voice seemed to be replaced by another emotion. You have chosen your fate again, mortals? We have personally handed the direction of fate back to you, but today, you have returned here again as if only to prove Alphonse's prophecy. You have awakened us again and we respect your choice. The gods will return to the earth and we will rebuild the order of the next era. And your era is over? Brando stared at this scene as if he was watching an animation in a game. After a long while he looked up and blurted out, "Are you Ko-Hua or Milos?" Ko-Hua lowered her head and looked at Brando. Two different emotions flashed in her silver-white eyes at the same time, but she finally fixed on one of them and said, "Of course I am Ko-Hua. But I am also Milos." Another voice rumbled. She gently raised her arm and in front of her, the space seemed to have been thrown with stones rippling out in circles. After the ripples spread out, holographic projections appeared behind them. Kurlutz Valas, Kronki at the border of the four territories, Toquinen of the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beastmen. He could even see the towering golden spires, White City, Thousand Sails Harbor, the rebuilt Cathedral of Ampere Seal, the Fortress of Krakor, the Elven Tip of Sonorso, the Ashen Fortress, and even the faraway Buffalo City that Brendel had only been to once in the Great Ice Age appeared in the countless images. Brendel could even see the towering golden spires, the White City, the Thousand Sails Harbor, the rebuilt Cathedral of Ampere Seal, the Fortress of Krakor, the Elven Tip of Sonorso, the Ashen Fortress, and even the faraway Buffalo City that Brendel had only been to once in the Great Ice Age. Brando's breathing became a little rapid. He stared at Ko-Hua and asked, "What do you want to do?" Ko-Hua looked at him proudly. "Yes?" A bolt of lightning passed through Brando's mind. "You can't do that," he shouted through gritted teeth. "Why not?" the girl's voice asked softly. Chapter 827. Kirkle Castle. For in the afternoon, Limo was jolted awake from the sofa. He looked at his coffee table, desk, and bookcase, which were shaking like they were possessed. They were moving in one direction in the room, and the teacups on the table were clinking non-stop. "It's an earthquake." Just as this terrifying thought surfaced in his mind, a loud bang sounded. The walnut door was smashed open by the guards. The one who rushed in was his trusted aide, but his expression was no better than his own. "My lord, you better come out and take a look." "Where's the princess?" Limo jumped up from the sofa like a leopard, grabbing his aide by the collar and roaring, "Evacuate everyone." The aide shook his head desperately. At this moment, a calm voice came from outside the door. "Mr. Knight, let him go. Calm down." The voice seemed to stab Limo, causing him to let go of his aide. He looked up and saw the half-elf girl standing behind the swaying door. Behind her were a few knights. Duke Vero was beside her in his long robe. The princess's expression was normal, and the duke did not seem to be panicking. Dust fell from the ceiling like smoke from time to time, landing on the two of them, but no one cared. Limo's face reddened. He did not expect the princess to be here. He had been sleeping too soundly. "Your Highness, we have to leave the building quickly," he suggested. "No need. This is not an earthquake." Princess Griffin replied, "Mr. Knight, take your men and inform the wizards of the Tower of Stars and Moon to activate the city's magical defenses." Magical defenses? Limo was stunned. Could it be that they were attacked? He subconsciously looked at the others suspiciously. Griffin sighed, but only the aide approached him carefully and whispered in his ear, "My lord, you'll understand once you go out and take a look." Wallerstein, 3:55 p.m. The alarm bell on the Holy Cathedral Tower rang, and the Griffin guards immediately rose into the sky and flew in all directions. In the outskirts of the town, the lush forest seemed to have been blown by a gust of wind. The emerald-green treetops rolled in waves, revealing the gray-white leaves below. The shockwaves passed through the clouds in the sky and tore the cotton-like clouds into pieces. The monk soldiers came out in full force and walked up the city wall in a long line. In the four directions of the city center, the minarets were shining with strong magic light. In the blink of an eye, a light purple hemispherical screen of light appeared above the city, covering the entire area from Mandolin Market to the Watergate. Looking down at the city from the sky, the panicked crowd was gathering along the streets towards the city center, as if some invisible fear was driving them forward. In the central plaza, Consul Kanan looked up with a pale face, as if he was facing the end of the world. "Martha above, please protect your people." Right behind him, the security chief's roar sounded like the roar of an angry dragon. "You damned idiots, what are you doing here? Go and inform the headquarters of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Get out. Tell them we're done for. All done for. Let them find out who did it, who cast the spell." The patrolling cavalry scattered in all directions. Toquinen Fortress, 4:10 in the afternoon. In contrast to the tense atmosphere in Waller, the Golden Lion City seemed to have been cast into a spell of silence that enveloped the entire city. The whole city was still. Every street, every square, and even the entrances of the bazaars and shops, the lionmen with long manes, the dwarves with axes, and the halflings in the grey wilderness were all like puppets under a spell. Everyone looked up at the sky in a daze. In the sky there were still dark clouds, but it was as if a circle of ripples was spreading out with the city as the center. All the dark clouds were instantly dispersed in all directions. The shockwaves spread out layer by layer, and the thick clouds were torn apart and rolled. In the end, they turned into light clouds in the shape of fish scales and were still drifting into the distant sky. The sky behind the clouds was blue, and the sun shone down directly. It was as clear as the surface of a still lake without a single blemish. There were no clouds for thousands of miles. The golden steeple of the Asamoah temple shone brightly under the sun. But no one cheered, no one praised such a miracle, and no one even dared to make a sound. The doors of the golden palace opened, and the elderly lionmen priests walked out of the temple with the help of the accompanying monks. Their white robes were like waves. But everyone looked at the sky, and almost lost their souls as they knelt down and prayed for the forgiveness of the gods. In the dark blue sky, the white lines of the Tiamat magic array were as clear as a magic array diagram drawn on a blackboard with chalk, but the arcs of different thicknesses did not intersect with each other. Each of the arcs spanned half the sky and had a diameter of more than 10,000 miles. The lines were a little like white trails, coming out from the light clouds in the distance, crossing the top of the head, and then connecting to the other side of the sky. A few vertical lines connected to the center of the circle of the entire magic array. Such a spectacular scene could only be seen on the most sunny days. But today such a scene only made the people who were watching it feel suffocated. The white magic array was overlapping, as if they were moving horizontally from the other half of the sky. Although there was no sound, it was as loud as rolling thunder in people's hearts. The magic array overlapped one another, and every time it moved, it swept across hundreds of miles of the sky. Finally, these rotating gears were aimed at the Toquinen fortress. Heavy pressure descended from the sky. At that moment, everyone in the city involuntarily prostrated themselves. It was as if they were listening to the teachings of the gods. Maynard looked up. The buzzing sound was getting louder and louder, and the folded sword knights were slowly retreating, but it was at this moment that several people present felt an indescribable feeling in their hearts. It was as if they were witnessing some kind of indescribable majestic power breaking out of its cocoon. Maynard, Little Perro, and the others, who were the last to retreat, turned their heads in unison. As if all of a sudden, there was a slight flash of light, and everyone saw a circle of faint light gathering from all directions. It seemed slow, but in fact it was very fast. Little Perro could tell at a glance that the light pattern started near Violet Castle in the west, and reached Kirkle in the east. It covered a range of hundreds of miles in the blink of an eye. The light waves swept across their position with a buzzing sound, and gathered at the center of the black building complex. It was just a blink of an eye. The light pattern completely gathered together, forming a dazzling ball of light. Then a beam of light rose straight from the center of the ball of light, and with a buzzing sound, it directly pierced through the clouds in the sky. The clouds were turbulent like waves, rippling layer by layer. Just the aftermath alone was enough to shock everyone to the core. This is, Ko Hua only touched it lightly with his hand. There was only pure white left in the image, and the white light spread out from the point where the beam of light fell like a tsunami, flooding the entire city. The towering towers, the city walls, the fortress, and the iconic golden minaret of Toquinen were all submerged in the dazzling light. There was no earth-shattering explosion, no sound of houses collapsing, no screams, no fire, only a flawless white light, just like the light that Martha descended when the world was born. After the light faded, Toquinen, the fortress that the lion folk were proud of, was completely erased from this world, and there was not a trace of its existence left. The 34,000 lion folk, dwarves, and halflings that lived in this city were all turned into ashes. In the grasslands of Toquinen, there was only a deep pit a few miles in diameter left. Smoke curled up from the pit, bearing witness to everything that happened just a moment ago. Brando stared at the scene with his mouth agape. Judgment of God, a 14-circle light elemental sorcery. Ko Hua did not even blink and pointed his finger at another image. Wallers? You're crazy. Brando roared. He stared at the other two images in fear. Ampere Seal, Kirkle. Princess Griffin was still in Kirkle. Ko Hua turned around and looked at him with his silver-white eyes that had become emotionless and asked, "Why do you say that, Mr. Human? Aren't you the ones who woke me up?" Her voice echoed in the hall, without a hint of guilt or excitement, as if that was all there was to it. The ones who woke you up were the believers of All for One. What does it have to do with us? Those people are innocent. The believers of All for One are the generation of Black Iron, and have the power to decide the fate of the world. They are a group of scum whose minds have been corrupted by dusk. So, you have turned yourselves into the messengers of destruction. Ko Hua smiled proudly. Damn it. Brando flew up and slashed his sword at Ko Hua above the platform, but when the blade was still 10 feet away from her, there was a buzz as if it had hit a wall of air. The space that was hit shook violently, and with the point of contact as the center, ripples of hexagonal light rippled out. Ko Hua glanced at him and moved her left hand in his direction. A circle of blazing white static electricity spread out with her as the center. Brando screamed and was directly bounced out, landing heavily on the ground. With just that, he lost a quarter of his life. He immediately gritted his teeth and got up from the ground, but it was at this time that a hand pressed down on his shoulder from behind. Even Brando himself did not notice when Veronica and Mephisto had come up behind him. The two sword saints put Peya and Yoruta down. The two siblings had probably fainted again during the fall and had yet to wake up. The two of them raised their heads at the same time and looked at Ko Hua in the center of the hall. Brando, what's going on? In the end, it was Veronica who asked first. Stop her, she's destroying the cities on the projection. She's now controlling Milo's body and can use Milo's divine power at will. Brando took a breath and immediately replied. Seeing Veronica and his teacher arrive, he was finally relieved. Now the strength of the three of them combined was not inferior to the entire team of around level 50 in the game. Veronica recognized Voles on the holographic projection at a glance. Her expression changed, and without any movement, the thin sword in the scabbard automatically came out of the scabbard and appeared in her hand. Brando glanced at the sword. It was not the azure firmament, but just a high-quality magic sword. Only then did he realize that the female commander's strength seemed to have grown a little. He did not know if it was the influence of the experience in the loop of trade winds or the great demonic wave. A complete true god? Mephisto frowned and asked. Hearing this question, Brando calmed down. No, from what Ko Hua said before, she should still be in the process of merging with Milo's body. In this state she could at most be considered a false god. However, even if she was a fake god, there was still a qualitative difference between her and a mortal. The barrier of light around her was the legendary divine barrier. Attacks from the mortal world would never be able to penetrate this barrier. But damn it, how was this battle supposed to be fought? If even Ko Hua himself could not be attacked, then wouldn't it be a one-sided slaughter? Impossible. If Ko Hua was really the legendary hidden boss, the awakening god Sarash, then there must be a flaw. Brando narrowed his eyes. He had already seen Veronica rushing toward Ko Hua. Her speed was astonishing. Like a green shadow, she circled behind Ko Hua in the blink of an eye. She stopped there, raised her long sword and crossed it in front of her. A green dragon flew out of the blade and went straight for Ko Hua. However, just like Brando's previous attack, the moment the green dragon hit the light screen, a hexagonal grid appeared in layers. The dragon instantly disintegrated, and then a ring of static energy bounced off the light screen. But this ring of static energy was cut in half by the green sword saint's sword before it could get close to Veronica. It did not affect her at all. In a breath's time, Veronica had finished her attack and counterattack. She landed lightly beside Brando, frowning deeply. Absolute difference? She looked at Brando. Brando nodded. Absolute difference was the natural chasm between all mortal power and divine power. This was the core law of the Tiamat law, divine power, also known as the absolute law. The power of existence took precedence over all laws and order. Only the power of existence could affect the gods. The power of mortals was like a bubble at this level. No matter how brilliant it was meaningless. She's not a true god. How can there be an absolute difference between us? Veronica almost gritted her teeth as she asked this question. Brando shook his head blankly. Indeed, Ko Hua was not a true god. How could there be an absolute difference? But that divine barrier was clearly a type of absolute difference. Moreover, if there was such a thing as an absolute difference, how could this battle be fought? He felt that there must be a problem somewhere. A battle of this level would not be prepared for players. He looked around, trying to find the hidden flaw. But at this moment he had a vague idea in his mind. This was a world quest. The world line in the game was split into two. The players in the past had chosen the former path, but he had accidentally chosen the latter. The future line had been completely changed. But whether it was good or bad was unknown. Chapter 828. In the underground of the abyss, after the ice layer fell off, the dark artificial buildings around gradually became clear. On the smooth obsidian wall, a platinum light was extending along the notches, and soon the entire corridor was lit up. Alaz and Medisha walked curiously along the corridor, but the two had been lost for a long time. We seem to have been walking in circles, Sister Alaz. The little female dragon's face turned red, but she held the star-shaped stone with one hand and waved her claws. Showing her little fangs, she replied, "How is that possible? You must have remembered wrongly." Medisha smiled. "Yes," she nodded and smiled. "Just like in the wild of the Four Realms, the reason why we haven't reached our destination yet is because we are walking too slowly." Alaz seemed to have been electrocuted. She turned around and stared at Medisha with wide eyes. You, how did you know? "I also know that you were the youngest dragon on the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints, Sister Alaz. In Moros, you snuck out on a date with Lord Flora, and were caught by the Wind Elf guards, and Lord Eloranta gave you a good scolding." Medisha whispered, "Do you remember what she said at the time? How can you get lost on a tryst? How can my subordinates be so much worse than Gretel and Saint Tassol? How embarrassing, get lost." The little fairy princess imitated the scene vividly. Alaz opened her mouth slightly like a puppy, showing her sharp fangs. Her face was like a ripe apple. "Impossible, how could anyone know about this? You, who are you?" Medisha tilted her head, smiled and did not answer. Alaz suddenly screamed. She looked at her with some surprise. "I remember, it's you, Princess Crescent. Why did you change your name to such a strange one?" "That's my surname, Sister Alaz." Medisha sighed. "My real name is Medisha." The little female dragon stuck out her tongue and replied with some annoyance, "You've changed." Medisha touched her forehead. "Sister Alaz, I am a heroic spirit, my appearance will not change." "Is that so?" Alaz scratched her round cheeks. "Then I probably remembered wrongly." "So let me lead the way," Medisha replied, "just like when we worked together before, okay?" But Alaz did not answer. Instead, she raised a finger and pressed it against Medissa's lips. "Shoo," she said. "Do you hear something?" Medissa was shocked and quickly took a small step back, glaring at her. "Really there?" The little female dragon quickly replied. "Really?" The silver elf princess raised her eyebrows slightly. She knew that the five senses of the golden race were much more sensitive than other races, but suddenly her pointed ears twitched. Both of them turned their heads in a certain direction at the same time. There was a crossroad in the long corridor, and a battered figure was limping slowly from there. After a while, Alaz and Medisha revealed themselves from the invisibility spell. "That guy looks familiar." The little female dragon showed her teeth. "Suspicious." "It's Dukarek," Medisha replied. She and Alaz looked at each other. The white beam of light pierced through heaven and earth. Maynard and the others turned their heads and stared in that direction from afar. The second time, Veronica looked angrily at Ko Hua as another image in front of her was drowned in the white light. Levis, the border city of Cruz, had been reduced to ashes. She was so angry that she almost crushed the hilt of her sword, but Brando held on tightly to the female commander, afraid that she would lose her mind. The three of them had launched many attacks on Ko Hua, but they had all returned without success. The divine barrier was like a wall of despair, lying between mortals and gods. There was no way to break through. Ko Hua turned her gaze to the next image, Oskin, a city of wind elves. Brando looked nervously at the rapidly changing images. There were still two more images, the beautiful castle on the shore of Lake Kirkle. He was so nervous that his palms were sweating. How could there be such a battle? He had to think of a way. At this time, Ko Hua suddenly looked up as if looking at something. Her voice once again echoed on the platform. "Sister, you're here." Brando was slightly startled. He turned his head and saw the figures of the young prince and Prince Leneret appear on the cliff. "Teacher. Lady Veronica." His and Shido's voices were the first to reach him, and then Brando saw another Ko Hua appear behind them. The dark side of Ko Hua in the middle of the hall frowned, while the kind Ko Hua just nodded gently. Could the key to the battle be the kind Ko Hua? This thought flashed through Brando's mind. "She is?" Mephistopheles asked. "That is also Ko Hua, the one controlling Milos is her dark soul." 1 and 2. Brando nodded. "Something like that." "Oh wait." He was surprised to see that Veronica had already charged in that direction. Obviously, this female army commander had thought of the same thing, but the problem was that Veronica was much more decisive than him. But by the time he reacted, the tip of Veronica's sword was almost in front of Ko Hua's face. The kind Ko Hua was almost stunned. Her eyes widened and she just stood there in a daze, not understanding why this human woman attacked her indiscriminately as soon as she saw her. Of course, even if she was not stunned, she might not be able to dodge Veronica's sword. After all, one was a spellcaster and the other was a warrior. In close combat there was no comparison at all. Ko Hua opened her mouth slightly, and just as Veronica's sword was about to pierce through her heart, Brando's anxious shout finally came. Stop her. Without thinking, the young prince pulled out his sword to stop her, but Veronica did not even look at him. The difference between the two was not on the same level. The young prince had just pulled out his sword when he felt a gentle force on his hand. Before he could react, the long sword had already flown out of his hand, and with a clang, it stabbed into the ceiling of the cave. But it was only a slight delay, and the kind Korfa finally reacted. She let out a low cry of, "Ah!" and fell back onto the ground in fright. Veronica's cyan sword aura flew over Ko Hua's head, only cutting off a few strands of hair. She frowned and prepared to attack again, but at this moment, Ko Hua's dark attack finally arrived. "How dare you!" The dark Ko Hua's voice rumbled and a white electric whip lashed out at Veronica. Veronica did not dare to block it directly, so she could only lean to the side and let the electric whip hit the cliff, cutting off a table-sized fragment from the solid wall. And with this delay, Veronica finally lost the chance to continue attacking the kind Ko Hua. She could not help but turn around and glare at Brando. But Brando only felt relieved. In fact, he had already thought it through. The key to this battle was definitely not Ko Hua. Ko Hua came to this platform because of him and the young prince. The key to this battle was definitely not a factor that could only appear on the battlefield. In other words, if Ko Hua did not appear, this battle could not be fought? This was obviously illogical. He hurriedly gestured to Veronica, indicating that he had something to explain. But at this moment, Brando saw the fragment that Ko Hua's electric whip had swept down behind Veronica tumbling down. It hit one of the energy transmission pipes and with a crack, it caved in. The pipe suddenly flashed and the light on it was quickly extinguished. Seeing this, Brando's heart skipped a beat. "I know, so it's here." He immediately looked up and shouted to Mephisto and Veronica, "Attack the platform! Attack those pipes!" The Ash Sword Saint and Veronica were slightly startled and looked at him with some confusion. Clearly they did not understand for a moment. Brando was so anxious that he could not help but shout, Ko Hua is just a false god. She has no divine barrier at all. The absolute difference in her body comes from Milo's. Her power comes from this platform. Right now, she has not completely merged with Milo's body. It will be fine as long as she is cut off from the platform. As soon as Brando's voice fell, dark Ko Hua, who was above the platform, changed her expression. "Don't joke around, you guessed wrong," she hurriedly defended herself. Veronica and Mephisto looked at each other and immediately flew to the left and right sides of the energy transmission network scattered to the left and right sides of the platform. With a few flashes of sword light, dozens of energy transmission pipes were cut in the middle. The disordered magic flow formed a pulse like a nova explosion. In the blink of an eye, several huge holes were blasted in the dense network. "Damn it!" Ko Hua screamed. She could no longer maintain her calm. She raised her hands and countless lightning bolts appeared out of thin air on the platform, like raindrops striking toward Brando, Mephisto, and Veronica. Mephisto and Veronica were fine. They could deal with these lightning attacks with a little distraction, but Brando was in a bit of trouble. It seemed that the other party was retaliating against him for finding out that weakness. Almost half of the lightning bolts were aimed at him. He only blocked 2 or 3 before the fourth hit him directly. His body went numb and he was immediately bathed in the lightning storm. If it were not for his ridiculously high will, he would probably be sent to see Martha directly. But even so, the dense lightning bolts still took away almost 2/3 of his HP. More importantly, his clothes were now like that of a beggar's. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that this AoE attack should be shared by everyone in the party. But now there were only 3 of them in the party, and Ko Hua saw him as the number 1 target. He could only blame himself for being unlucky. After the lightning storm, Veronica and Mephisto launched another attack. But this time Ko Hua was smarter. She simply gave up on attacking altogether. Instead, she channeled all her energy into the ground and supported a strong protective shield over the pipes. In the beginning, Brando could cut through several pipes with a single slash. But after Ko Hua cast the shield, she might not be able to cut through even one pipe. He looked back and saw that the progress of Veronica and Mephisto had been greatly reduced. However, Brando felt that Ko Hua's brain was probably a little off. Although she did greatly slow them down, the problem was that if she did not attack, the pipes would be cut through one by one. Of course, Brando was happy to see the boss being stupid. No one would complain that their boss battle was too easy. Besides, he vaguely felt that the problem was not so simple. Please wait a moment. Scarlet heard the voice behind her and turned back. She glanced at the young man who had caught up from behind. She remembered that he seemed to have introduced himself as Babarn or something else. The name sounded a little strange to her. Erwin rarely had such a name, so she had a deeper impression of it. The young man ran, panting. He probably had something urgent to attend to. The Highlander girl stared at him blankly. After a while, she remembered that she should be the one asking the question. What's the matter? Beautiful lady, I still don't know your name. Scarlet frowned. What does my name have to do with you? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to thank you. The young man replied breathlessly. He faintly felt the hostility of the other party. He was a little surprised but immediately added. Thank me? Yes, thank you for saving us. I can't not repay you for saving my life. Scarlet thought for a moment. Babarn seemed a little nervous. He did not know why, but he always felt that he could not move freely in front of the other party. At first, he thought that it was because the other party was too much to his liking. But after spending some time together, he began to gradually feel that there seemed to be a strange temperament in the other party, faintly exuding a frightening aura. Of course, he did not know that the blood of the dragon and the thunder god flowed in Scarlet's body at the same time. He vaguely felt that the Countess's handmaiden was a little unusual. He suddenly felt a little nervous and began to regret that he should not have agreed to work with those guys. At this time, Scarlet finally recovered from her daze. She looked up at the surrounding cliffs and asked as if she was referring to something. You said that you want to thank me. Is this how you thank me? The young man was slightly stunned. But Scarlet had already picked up the halberd in her hand and pointed in all directions of the underground glacier. These rats hiding in the corner, are they your companions? Babarn's face changed. At the same time, the faces of the noble soldiers who were pointed out by the mountain girl did not look good. They awkwardly walked out from the shadows and looked at the girl with some surprise. Only the leader of the group applauded and praised dryly. This is really beyond our expectations. I didn't expect the young lady to be a real master. Scarlet looked at these people quietly and frowned. But she was secretly prepared to be on guard. After all, she was a mercenary. Just by looking at the position of these people, she knew that they were not friendly. Don't worry, the man continued. We do want to thank the young lady. We hope that the young lady will come with us to cruise as a guest. The Empire has always been hospitable. We will definitely treat you well. Babarn quickly nodded. Yes, we won't embarrass you. We just want to ask you for a favor. A favor? Yes, beautiful lady. If you agree, I will personally ask His Majesty to restore your freedom. You will become a free citizen of Cruz. You will not have to bow to anyone. Besides, with your ability, it is not impossible for you to become a noble of the Empire. Babarn explained. But never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he had said something wrong. In fact, just as he finished saying that he would let her regain her freedom, he saw that the eyes of the seemingly innocent mountain girl were already glinting with the ferocity of a wild beast. P.S. Today is 10/7. 3 chapters updated, a total of 13,000 words. After today the stable updates will be restored. But I will consider adding more on weekends and Sundays. Also, I am looking for monthly votes. Chapter 830. Babarn felt Scarlet suddenly disappear in front of him. He immediately reacted. She did not disappear, but the mountain girl had passed him and circled behind him. But she was too fast. His eyes widened slightly, and he turned his head stiffly, only to see a fiery red afterimage in the corner of his eye. It was the end of a long ponytail. Behind Viscount Babarn, the Kurlutzian noble who had been leading the agitation saw this scene more clearly. In his eyes, the mountain girl was still negotiating with Babarn a moment ago, but suddenly she had moved away from the latter by a body's length. His left foot stepped lightly on the ground, his whole body tilted to the same side, the blade of the spear in his hand was one step ahead, and a cold light flashed. The girl looked up and stared at him, a circle of golden flame seemed to be burning from the inside out. Her crimson ponytail danced with her movements, like a dancing feather scarf. In the blink of an eye, the fire dragon was already in front of him. Not good. The Cruz noble's hair stood on end, and he subconsciously raised the long sword in his hand. Clang. A line of sparks crossed and the Kurlutzian noble staggered back. The force from the spear was so great that he had to hold his sword with both hands to block it, but in the same way this also made him lose the chance to fight back. The crew's noble was covered in cold sweat, and there was only one thought in his mind: so fast. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that this seemingly weak and introverted girl would attack him without saying a word. And her target wasn't Babarn but him. How did she see through it? He looked at the sword in his hand with lingering fear, and there was a deep cut on the blade. The crew's noble's hands were shaking. Scarlet immediately retreated when her attack missed. She frowned slightly. She originally wanted to take the leader by surprise, but she didn't expect the other party to react so quickly. The Kurlutzian soldiers were indeed worthy of their reputation. Stop her. Only then did someone react. To be able to survive the previous fall under the ice, all the survivors were at least of the gold level. Even the leading noble and Viscount Babarn had the same elemental awakening strength as Scarlet, because they did not feel threatened at first. 7 or 8 people against one, and the opponent was a woman. No matter how they thought about it, it was not dangerous at all. But they never thought that Scarlet was no longer a human in the simple sense. To be precise, her bloodline had long surpassed the Black Iron generation. The crew's nobles roared in unison, and at the same time, the long swords in their hands flashed into a cold light, blocking Scarlet's retreat from all directions. Only then did people remember that they were not only of outstanding swordsmen, but also well-trained soldiers. But unfortunately their opponent was Scarlet. The mountain girl had arguably the most outstanding and unique swordsmanship training partner in the world. Brando was familiar with the crew's Erwin, Fanzin, and even the undead of Madara, the wind elves of Saint Tassol, each of the most mainstream swordsmanship in this era. Even more than that, he had a lot of ways to deal with each swordsmanship. As soon as the crew's noble soldiers moved, Scarlet had already reacted. She stepped lightly on the ground while retreating quickly, and with one foot as an axis she turned around, and the spear in her hand had already drawn a semicircle, forcing the crew's nobles who were approaching from the right to retreat. At the same time, the girl had already lowered her center of gravity, and with the other foot on the ground, she suddenly burst out from the ground, shooting forward like a sharp arrow. She chose the direction of the left wing, where the encirclement was weaker. There were only 3 swordsmen in that direction, and one of them was only at the beginning of the gold level. And her target happened to be this person. The man was already stunned. The speed of the mountain girl's dash had exceeded everyone's expectations, and was at least 3 times faster than the peak of the gold level. Every time Scarlet's foot touched the ground, a long arc of electricity would be drawn out. In the eyes of outsiders, it was as if a bolt of lightning was leaping continuously on the ground. The bright electric light continued to bend, as if it was splitting the darkness, and in an instant she had already arrived in front of the crew's noble. In the man's vision, only the bright golden flames in the girl's eyes were left. The spear pierced through his chest, and the crew's noble did not have time to let out a scream of pain before it was stuck in his throat. Blood gushed out from his lungs, turning into a gurgling sound, and then he spat out a mouthful of blood foam. The girl pressed a hand on his chest and pushed, and the guy's body was thrown out like a tattered rag doll. She's hiding her strength. The head of the nobles was buzzing in his head. No, this is definitely not the power of elemental activation. That's 2 levels of existence. This little girl's strength is still at the gold level, but why is there such a huge difference? He could not figure it out no matter how hard he racked his brain, and did not think of the dragon race at all. Because if Scarlet was a dragon, first of all, she would never be a servant of humans, and secondly, she would not have to play a game of cat and mouse with them here. Unfortunately, no one would have thought that Scarlet's current situation was a result of a conspiracy and an unexpected prank. Scarlet had already torn the line of defense, but she was still not out of danger. She looked back and saw that the crew's noble was still approaching, and one on the left and one on the right were the 2 noble soldiers she had left behind, and the one chasing after her was the leader. She simply raised her left hand, her fingers slightly closed, and made a strangling gesture. Everyone saw that in an instant Scarlet's left arm seemed to have turned into pure energy, and turned into a blazing platinum color. Arcs of electricity surrounded her arm, and then suddenly, with a sizzling sound, shot towards the 3 of them. Elemental materialization. The noble soldier on the left was shocked, and quickly rolled to the side to avoid the attack. But his companion was not so lucky, and was directly hit in the chest by the electric arrow. He spat out a mouthful of blood and flew back, crashing into the crowd. The people behind hurriedly helped him up, and found that the guy's breastplate had been penetrated and melted, and the soft tissue behind had been completely carbonized. His eyes were wide open, and his eyes were staring unfocused at the top of the hole. Apparently he had gone to see Martha. The leader of the nobles was shocked and angry, and he slashed the lightning with his sword. His sword was wrapped in orange lines of the law, and it tore the lightning apart like cotton wool, dissipating into countless arcs of electricity. At this time, Scarlet no longer held back, and her whole body was wrapped in electric arcs, as if half of her body had turned into blazing white lightning. Her speed was further increased to a level that the crew's nobles had never imagined in their lives. It was like a beam of light in the dark, and there was no stopping it. The nobles looked at this scene stunned. It was not that they had never seen this kind of skill before, but it was a special skill of the lightning element and the air element. How could it appear on a human? Even if it was the law of lightning, it only allowed humans to control lightning. How could she turn it into lightning? Everything in front of them was simply subverting their understanding of the law. The glaring lightning had already drawn a beautiful arc in the darkness. In fact, semi-elementization was an ability that Scarlet had accidentally mastered after entering the elemental awakening. According to Brando, this ability itself was not something that could be found, and generally only existed in those races that were close to the elements. Very few humans could obtain this ability. He suspected that the high tolerance of the dragon blood in Scarlet's body further catalyzed the power of the thunder god's blood, and gave Scarlet a part of the elemental bloodline. It was just that Scarlet did not have the same attribute panel as him, or he would have seen it in the racial talent column. Unfortunately, semi-elementization required a certain amount of time, or she could have used this ability to break through the encirclement from the beginning. Why is she turning back? The leader of the nobles looked at the long arc in the dark in surprise. She's coming to fight us. Damn it, Babarn, you've pissed her off, she's going to kill us. Cruz's noble soldiers suddenly panicked and shouted. They thought they were just dealing with a little girl, but in the blink of an eye, the little girl had turned into a big bad wolf with fangs, and they had become Little Red Riding Hood. The difference in status was too great and they could not accept it for a while. Shut up. Babarn was also sweating profusely. He still had a good impression of Scarlet, and the fact that she was so powerful made him both surprised and happy. He was surprised that today's battle would end, and happy that he was more and more satisfied with this mountain girl. However, he still couldn't figure out what he had said that had angered the other party. Although his words were somewhat threatening, it wasn't as if they couldn't be accepted. How could a maid have such a bad temper? How could the Count stand it? But at least Babarn was not wrong about one thing. Scarlet was completely enraged. She moved forward in her lightning form and shot straight into the crowd. The girl's pointed face had completely turned into an energy body similar to the deified Ko Hua, and her hair and eyebrows were like platinum electric beams dancing in the wind, especially her long ponytail, which looked amazingly beautiful. Scarlet's brows were deeply furrowed, and her golden eyes were burning with anger. There was only one thought in her mind at the moment: kill these annoying people. Since the disbandment of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Scarlet almost all of her thoughts were placed on protecting her remaining companions. Since most of them joined and became Brando's private army, she also chose to silently follow the somewhat unfamiliar young noble. And the mountain girl, Scarlet of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, from that moment on, in fact, had passed away and no longer existed in this world. She began to become silent, and practiced her combat skills all day long, or in a daze, and no one knew what she was thinking. Because even she did not understand what was going on in her mind. Perhaps she was thinking about the strange words of the Count, who sometimes did not seem like a noble, but sometimes was more noble than all the other nobles. To control one's own destiny, how could one control it? Day after day she made herself colder, better at fighting, and less trusting of others, as if she was a machine, but her heart became more and more fragile. Sometimes she even felt that she was walking alone in the wilderness, standing alone. When she looked around, the original world seemed to have collapsed. More than once, Scarlet shed tears alone in the night, sobbing softly. Everything that had happened in the past 10 years was like a stretched shadow of a nightmare, and she could not get rid of it. But until that day when the strange Count handed the golden apple to her, and told her that no matter what, he would not give up on her, and in that dark dream, there was finally a ray of warm light. It was something that even Lord Makarov, Lord Fleetwood, and everyone who betrayed the Grey Wolves mercenaries wanted, but the Count just gave it to her because of a promise. She was not good with words and she did not know how to repay him. She just wanted to be by his side silently. Because of this, she became even more silent. Until today, when these disgusting Cruz people in front of her wanted to destroy her only hope, her anger had completely drowned all of her rationality. These people must die. 2 screams. A noble soldier's head fell to the ground, and another soldier screamed and held his arm. Below his wrist, it was already charred black, and the brittle bones seemed to be unable to bear the weight of the longsword. The falling longsword broke his arm, and it turned into black powder and fell to the ground together. The leader of the nobles was sweating profusely, and he turned back to Babarn and shouted, "Babarn, if you don't do something there will be no end to this." Babarn cursed silently, thinking that the current situation was also because of this guy. He secretly regretted it. Originally, these people's conspiracy had nothing to do with him, but he did want to invite this mountain girl back to the Kurlutz Empire as a guest. He felt that it was love at first sight, and he wanted to make her his woman no matter what, but he never dreamed that things would develop to this point. He sighed and had to take out a folded crossbow from his sleeve. At this point he had no choice but to use this thing. He loaded the crossbow and raised it. At this time, Scarlet turned into a flash of lightning and crossed the crowd of Crew's nobles. Babarn immediately turned and aimed in that direction. He did not aim accurately, of course. With Scarlet's current speed, there was no point in aiming accurately. The Viscount muttered something, and the pattern on the crossbow in his hand suddenly lit up one by one. In the Amber Sword, magic weapons that can be activated by themselves must be silver items of ancient grade or above, but this crossbow was not just that. In fact, it was a big deal. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize the identity of this crossbow, and further recognize Babarn's identity. Unfortunately, Scarlet was not Brando, and the girl was still unaware at this moment. A silver light pierced through the darkness. Scarlet suddenly felt a huge force coming from behind, and the severe pain almost instantly broke her semi-elemental state. The lightning wrapped around her suddenly exploded, forming a dazzling electric spark. The mountain girl fell forward like a kite with a broken string, and hit the ice hard. Although she immediately gritted her teeth and got up, everyone saw that the crossbow bolt was stuck in her waist. The girl gritted her teeth, covered the place with one hand, and used the other hand to support her body with the spear. She was trembling so much that she could barely stand. The noble soldiers cheered in unison. Scarlet's vision turned black. Of course, she heard the cheers, although the sound seemed to come from the sky, but what made her feel even colder was that the noble soldiers had already surrounded her from the left and right. She gasped softly and felt a salty taste in her mouth, but she still subconsciously clenched her teeth and clenched the spear in her hand. Those pipes should be for Ko Hua's sister. To channel magic, we should find a way to help the Count and the others cut off those pipes. Miss Scholar was lying on the edge of the ice wall, staring at the battle below, but when she said this, she was a little concerned about the expression of Ko Hua beside them. The latter smiled at her, indicating that it was nothing. After getting the nod, Shido was relieved and asked, "Your Royal Highness, do you have any ideas?" Lenoret nodded. He glanced down, although his face was still expressionless. "The level of the battle below is not something we can get involved in. If we go down, we will only be a burden to Teacher and Count Tonagel. Fortunately, we don't need to go down to participate in the battle. I have a bow, Shido. You can still use magic. Let's do it before that woman notices us." With that said, His Royal Highness also glanced at Brando below, with a rare look of envy in his eyes. He was slightly older than Brando, but the other's strength was really not something to be jealous of. A 20-year-old knight of the Holy Cathedral, how shocking it would be if word got out. Fortunately, the higher-ups of the two countries who knew about this were actually only the core figures. The Holy Cathedral of Fire should be very clear about the news contained in this information, and they would not spread it casually. After all, the other party was not Cruz's people, but this was also the most unfortunate part. He now slightly understood Veronica's thoughts. But fortunately, this Count Tonagel had a good relationship with them. He was nominally Veronica's student, and his political orientation was also supported by the Palucci family. Brando was close to Veronica, so he was naturally a friend of his faction. "What about me?" Haruz asked. "You stay here and help us keep an eye on the surroundings," Larinat replied. "Huh." The little prince opened his mouth wide and he hurriedly shook his head vigorously. Teacher is still fighting down there. How can I just stand by and watch?" "This is not standing by and watching. His Royal Highness is right. Little prince, you have to keep an eye on this time. Don't let those guys from All for One guys make trouble behind us." A voice suddenly came from the ice cave behind them. "You don't think we're the only ones down here, do you?" Prince Haruz's eyes lit up slightly, and he turned back in surprise and shouted, "Mr. the Shire." Then he froze for a moment and added, "Sister Hippamera." Coming out from behind the ice cave were two of Brando's 3 planeswalker summons. Chapter 831. Brando was naturally overjoyed by the sudden appearance of the Shire and Hippamera, But Dark Kohua was not necessarily so. In fact, the current situation was not very optimistic for her. In addition to Brando, Mephisto and Veronica were both extremely good at swordsmanship with a wide range of damage. In their hands, even if the platform was equipped with magical protection, it could only hold up for a while, but it was still decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. In just a moment, more than a third of it was gone. At this moment, the Shire and Hippamera, who were slowly floating down from the cliff one after another, were serious spellcasters and spellcasters. Whether it was elementalists or law wizards, or even witches or summoners, they were all masters of ranged attacks, even if they were spellcasters such as priests, and priests. At least they were much more professional than warriors. After a series of battles, especially after sharing the huge amount of experience from the battle between Maine and Mare, the Shire and Hippamera had reached level 39 at this time. In fact, they could already be regarded as early gold rank. Although they were far from their peak level, it was more than enough to cut the pipe. Plus Lenneret, a genuine gold rank, and Shido, the other half of a spellcaster. Even if they only helped with long-range attacks, Dark Kohua's defense soon became precarious. The situation was not optimistic. She suddenly became anxious and shouted angrily, "Sister, are you just going to watch outsiders deal with me?" Everyone was stunned, especially Shido and the others, who hurriedly looked back at Kohua. But the latter frowned and shook her head, replying, "I won't participate in the battle, that's not what I yearn for. Sister, give up unrealistic wishes, the gods no longer belong to this world. I know you want to take the opportunity to early. Some let dusk come, but dusk is dusk after all. It represents the eternity of the Sea of Chaos. It doesn't matter if it's earlier or later, this in itself is an immutable truth. Resurrecting me, isn't this someone's choice? Mortals are always full of themselves. I'm just following Milo's wishes and teaching them a lesson." Two voices answered. The Dark Kohua gritted his teeth and sneered, "Of course I'm happy to see this happen. Milos wants to follow his agreement with the crystal and the dark dragon. When the gods are resurrected, he will let them go." The world was repeating the classical order. As for me, I'm merely tasting the taste of destruction. We each take what we need. This is not contradictory. But there are more people here who don't want to see the revival of the gods. You can't let them only choose one, Kohua answered. Dark Kohua was speechless. Forget it, I'm not going to argue with you about these meaningless things. Anyway, I don't expect you to stand with me. Just watch and see how I deal with these insects. Brando landed steadily on one of the pipes. He knew that Kohua must have a backup plan. A boss battle couldn't be that simple, not to mention this was a hidden boss. Or according to the game, they hadn't even passed the first stage of the boss. The tip of the Howran Gaia stood between his legs. Between his feet, he pressed down with both hands, firmly holding the gauntlet, and then looked up at the newborn goddess, in the center of the platform. "Teacher Brando, watch out for your head." Haru's tender voice came from above. Lenneret asked him to help monitor the movements around. He didn't expect it to come in handy at this moment. But what he saw was not the black-robed knight of All for One, but dozens of heavy constructs descending from the sky. The light above the platform almost dimmed slightly. Two golems clad in heavy armor and wielding double-headed greatswords with a pair of wings made of 6 luminous feathers behind their armor slowly descended in a circle, one after the other. Blazing wings. It turned out to be this kind of thing. Drive them away. Dark Kohua's voice echoed in the hall. "But don't kill them, I want them to witness with their own eyes how the order of this era ends." Red light flashed under the helmets of the 32 constructs, and the wings on their backs spread out at the same time. Their formation moved, and the perfect arc in the air suddenly collapsed. All the blazing wing god envoys flew in 4 directions at the same time, and countless intertwined spirals were drawn in the air. These were from the ancient times. The divine weapons whistled as they swooped down towards everyone in the hall. The first to bear the brunt was naturally Mephisto, who was in the uppermost airspace of the hall. 7 blazing wings targeted him, but the Ash Sword Saint, who had stepped into the ultimate realm, did not care about these artificial creations because even the Hazel people, who were masters of magical technology on the continent of Wond, designed the most sophisticated golems. Compared to the Annihilation machines, they were at most at the level of elemental activation. The Hazel people could use their numbers to defeat the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but 7 elemental activated constructs were nothing more than flies to the Ash Sword Saint at this time. He calmly raised his head, and the 7 blazing wings came into view. From this moment on, with him as the center, everything within a 360-degree angle was under his attack range. He raised his sword and the sword stood straight. Between the blade and him and between the blade and the blazing wings, it was as if two worlds were separated. One was still, the other was moving. The ash sword saint remained motionless, and then gently slashed at one of the blazing wings with his sword. Crash! It was like the sound of metal shattering. The blazing wing oracle disintegrated in midair without any warning. In fact, it was not entirely correct to say that there was no warning, because as long as one had a little eyesight, one could see that a thin gray line first appeared on the armor of the construct, and then along that thin line, a thin gray line appeared. It first split into 2, then broke again, then into 4, then into 8, until it shattered into a pile of gray smoke and dissipated in midair. Even Brendel could not help but exclaim in admiration when he saw this scene. The most famous fantasy swordsmanship in the Amber Sword, each of them had a mesmerizing beauty when displayed. It was a pity that this swordsmanship required the ash element as a foundation, and he couldn't learn it even if he wanted to. At this time, Mephisto slashed at the second blazing wing god emissary, but this time he miscalculated. The construct holding the two-handed greatsword suddenly paused in midair, then rolled horizontally. A gray ripple cut along its left arm and shoulder armor, starting from the shoulder blade. This blazing construct was very fast. It was a blazing construct. Suddenly, a blazing construct appeared. The entire left half of the blazing wing's body turned into dust with a bang, and even the double-headed greatsword couldn't be held firmly, falling into the abyss. Mephisto was also slightly surprised. But this was the characteristic of divine creatures. Creatures of the same kind would share memories and experience. They often grew rapidly on the battlefield, and sometimes even became more terrifying skilled fighters than players. Brando didn't intend to remind Mephisto, after all, he was his teacher, not to mention 7 blazing wings against him. It shouldn't be a problem for Mephisto to deal with them, and the key was that he had already seen the other 7 blazing wings flying towards Veronica at the same time, and on the other side, a total of 12 blazing wings were flying towards him. Dark Kohua's hatred for him was evident. Brando could only shake his head and smile bitterly. "Teacher, be careful." Above his head, the little prince couldn't help but remind him loudly. He saw that there were as many as 12 blazing wings surrounding Brando from all directions. He was so nervous that he could hardly breathe, his hands clasped the scabbard of the lion's fang, and his little face was pale. Lenoret also looked in that direction. He thought for a moment and raised the white longbow in his hand. This bow was called Tranquility's Distance, and it was also a famous fantasy weapon collected by the Cruz royal family. The eldest prince drew the bow. There were no arrows on the bowstring, but the air automatically gathered to form a bunch of arrows in his hand. In the shape of an arrow, he aimed in the direction where Brando was, ready to lure 1 or 2 constructs over to deal with him. But Kohua seemed to be able to see through the minds of everyone present. Before he released the bowstring, the entrance of the cave darkened slightly, and a blazing wing ambassador had appeared in front of him. That thing made a soft sound similar to a buzzing sound, and directly raised the greatsword in both hands to stab them. Shido was so frightened that she covered her head with both hands, and Lenoret didn't even think about it. He narrowed his eyes and released the bowstring, and an arrow pierced the dark face of the blazing wing ambassador under his helmet. On the battlefield around the platform, 3 blazing wing ambassadors found the Shire, and 2 blocked the way of Hipamera. A chaotic battle was slowly unfolding. Brando looked at the 12 blazing wing ambassadors swooping towards him from all directions, and he was a little nervous. He didn't know how long it had been since he fought with these things. He had fought with them before, but the blazing wing ambassadors of this era couldn't be compared to the ones of that era. He was also a little excited. The blood of the warrior seemed to be burning in his bones. "Come on." Brando showed his snow-white teeth, like a beast choosing a person to devour. The first blazing wing ambassador arrived in a flash. It stretched out the blade of its double-ended sword horizontally, and made up its mind to sweep past Brando with the speed of its dive. But in its spherical vision, its target suddenly disappeared. The reaction of the blazing wing ambassador was not slow, although it continued to move forward under the influence of inertia. But it had already turned around in midair, and the double-ended sword in its hand slashed backward. Unfortunately, it only hit the air. Red light flashed under its helmet, and it seemed to raise its head in surprise. In its spherical vision, a dark blade came head-on. With a crash like the sound of broken glass, the blade of the Haurangaya cut along the helmet of the blazing wing ambassador. It went downwards, splitting the head into 2 halves, and a bright magical brilliance burst out. Then it continued downwards, cutting into the body with the spine as the center, splitting it into 2 halves. All the other blazing wing ambassadors saw this scene. Just as Brando fell from the sky and slashed at their kind, the remaining 11 blazing wing ambassadors adjusted their direction and surrounded him with a buzzing sound. At the same time, red light flashed under their helmets, and a blood-red ray suddenly shot out, piercing straight at Brando. 3 of the rays missed, and the remaining 8 rays respectively pierced through Brando's head, chest, thigh and left arm. But unfortunately these attacks were meaningless. Brando's sword had not yet been pulled out from the body of the first blazing wing ambassador, but at the same time, his figure appeared in the second and the third, behind the 4th blazing wing ambassador. The second blazing wing ambassador did not even have time to react before it was pierced through the heart by the sword and fell into the abyss. The 3rd blazing wing ambassador only had time to turn its head, and Brando stretched out his left hand and pressed down on its helmet. A ball of flame exploded from Bahamut's blessing, and the blazing wing ambassador almost trembled from the explosion. Brando took the opportunity. The sword was inserted into its throat, and the hilt of the sword made a half-circle along its neck. The unlucky blazing wing ambassador's head was immediately separated from its body. Brando casually threw its head out, and it hit another blazing wing ambassador not far away, and a crisp sound rang out. The blazing wing ambassador was immediately attracted. It raised its huge sword in both hands and swung it in a full circle in midair, then slashed down at Brando. The blade of the sword cut through Brando's shoulder, and the next moment, its figure twisted and disappeared. At this time Brando had already fought with the 4th blazing wing ambassador, but this time the blazing wing ambassador dodged his first sneak attack, causing him to slash empty air. Brando stared at the blazing wing ambassador's dodging movements with some excitement. These divine creatures had gradually begun to become more powerful. At this time, there were still 20 blazing wing ambassadors left on the field. Brando and Mephisto had each killed 3 of the 3 blazing wing ambassadors, Veronica had 2, and the Shire had 1. But for the remaining blazing wing ambassadors, Brando knew that each of them was more powerful than the previous blazing wing ambassadors. However, this was not a problem for Brando. At this time, if the blazing wing ambassador had the ability to think, it would have discovered that Brando seemed to know their attack patterns like the back of his hand. The 4th blazing wing ambassador turned around to counterattack, but it discovered with a flash of red light that Brando seemed to have expected it to do so. He easily dodged to the side with a mocking expression on his face. It was deeply imprinted in its vision, and at the same time, a palm wrapped in a metal glove appeared on its attack route and grabbed its wrist with a click. Before the blazing wing ambassador had time to react, it felt lifted into the air and then crashed heavily into something. Brando directly slammed the 2 blazing wing ambassadors together with a shoulder throw, and then with a backhand slash, they were annihilated together. At this time, Mephisto had just killed another blazing wing ambassador, which meant that Brando's killing speed at this moment was ahead of everyone present. Lenoret finally defeated their only opponent with the help of Shido's spell. The eldest prince's face was taut, and his chest rose and fell rapidly. Shido looked at the strange machine that stumbled out of the hole, gasping for breath. The notebook she was holding had a deep cut in it. If it wasn't for the thickness of the book, it wouldn't have been so thick. If it were not for the thick notebook, she would probably be lying in a pool of blood at this moment. But compared to that, the scholar would rather lie in a pool of blood. She looked at the notes she had accumulated with great difficulty, and tears were about to fall. But Haruz was more nervous than the 2 of them. He was covered in ice shards and hurriedly got up and ran to the entrance of the cave, as if he was afraid that his teacher would be killed by those monsters. He had seen how powerful those monsters were before. Prince Lenoret, Shido, and he had managed to kill one of them with great difficulty. But now. However, when he looked at the platform below, he was surprised to find that the battle below was very different from what he had imagined. Brando was also injured. But this injury was in exchange for the 3 blazing wing ambassadors. His right hand was dripping with blood, and the blood even flowed through the hilt, bypassed the guard, and dripped down along the dark blade of the Howran Gaia. But beside him, the original 12 blazing wing ambassadors had long been scattered, leaving only 5 floating shakily in the air. From time to time, attacks were launched from all directions. But at this time, Brando had completely integrated into the memory of the past battle, and the instincts of a player seemed to have returned to him. He was no longer a planeswalker but a genuine veteran warrior. His attacks were not limited to swordsmanship. Players' attacks had always been about results, not focusing on during this process. Haruz was dumbfounded. He saw that his teacher had completely given up his defense and rushed towards one of the blazing wing ambassadors like a meteor. The blazing wing ambassador immediately stabbed his teacher with its double-ended sword. The speed of the two was so fast that even the little prince almost thought that his teacher was going to be injured. However, Brando seemed to have expected it. He moved slightly to the side and made the opponent's attack completely miss. At the same time, his sword pierced into the opponent's chest without any hindrance, making a crisp sound like a broken gear. At this time, the remaining blazing wing emissaries surrounded him, but Haruz saw that his teacher didn't even turn his head. Instead, he threw a backhand punch. This punch was beyond everyone's expectations. It hit the side of the blazing wing emissary's helmet, which was the cheek. The force was so great that the blazing wing emissary's head was almost dented. The strange machine flew out, starting from the head and then the body, under the astonished gaze of the little prince. This punch must have hurt a lot. He could not help but squint because he saw that the head of the strange machine was so twisted that even the parts and gears inside seemed to have flown out. Haruz also knew swordsmanship. He estimated the reaction of the strange machine and thought that it was not that the other party was not prepared, but it was guarding against the sword in Brando's hand. It never dreamed that it would be punched by this human. Teacher, really? Haruz swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Although Brando taught him swordsmanship, he had never seen his teacher fly into a rage. He heard from his sister that the Count seemed to be a brilliant summoner, but he had never thought that his swordsmanship would be like this. The king of Erewhon lay at the entrance of the cave in a daze. For a moment he felt that he could not accept it, but for a moment he felt his blood boil. This was the battle in his mind. Chapter 832. The Count's swordsmanship is really... Shido was also in disbelief. I have never seen such swordsmanship. Efficient and practical. Lenoret breathed a sigh of relief. He also had several injuries on his body, but the prince of the crew's people did not show any pretense at all. Instead, he looked more like a qualified warrior. He said with a straight face, although it is a little too vulgar and has no aristocratic bearing. This kind of swordsmanship is simply born to defeat the opponent. Shido muttered to herself. Swordsmanship is originally a killing technique, and the sword is a weapon for killing. The young prince did not say a word, but he suddenly remembered what his sister had told him. Your teacher's swordsmanship is not even a killing swordsmanship born on the battlefield, but a swordsmanship on how to end a battle cleanly. So, it's natural and smooth without any sloppiness. I'm also very curious about what kind of environment can create such a swordsmanship. This was the way players fought. They did not seek to finish the job in one blow, but once they seized the opportunity, they would pursue and attack with the greatest burst of power. It did not matter even if they suffered a little injury. Veronica was also paying attention to the battlefield. She originally thought that Brando would be in a difficult battle and made up her mind to support him as soon as he could not hold on. But what she did not expect was that Brando not only did not fall into a difficult battle, but also gained the upper hand. Her cyan eyes flashed with a trace of incredulity. In her eyes, Brando shuttled between the pipes of different heights, using the terrain to deal with those weird machines, and always launched attacks in incredible ways. The blazing wing oracle was either stabbed in the back, colliding with his own people, or simply kicked to the wall by Brando. With electric arcs and sparks, they fell into the abyss below one by one. This was not because of any swordsmanship at all. This was experience. The female legion commander was full of surprise because she understood that it was not Erewhon's military swordsmanship, and it had nothing to do with the White Raven swordsmanship, nor was it the swordsmanship similar to flash strike sword art mentioned in the intelligence. It was just combat experience. For a moment she was in a trance. How could such a person exist? Brando was only 20 years old. She knew very well that the intelligence gathered from various sources proved that the other party was not lying. But for a 20-year-old young man, where did his terrifying combat experience come from? Sometimes she couldn't even understand how he could kill the enemy like that. This could only mean one thing: her knowledge couldn't keep up with Brando's thinking. This was simply absurd, which meant that the young man's combat experience might even surpass hers. Logic told her that it was right, but experience told her that it was impossible. Veronica was very conflicted. She was also a sacred swordsman and a famous one at that. She was the commander of the Cruz Empire's azure firmament. She had fought against the Hazel people, the monsters, and the pagans. Looking at her life, it seemed that half of her 50 years of life was spent in battle. She was too proud to admit it. This was no longer a matter of talent. Veronica racked her brains, but she couldn't figure out why this happened. She couldn't help but raise her head and look at Mephisto, who was not far away. The Ash Sacred Swordsman's eyes were also filled with inexplicable surprise. However, Mephisto was surprised, but she was a little regretful. "You took in a good student, Mephisto?" Veronica was very jealous. If she knew this would happen, she would have pulled Brando to her side at the loop of trade winds. Now she regretted it. Who cared about the Cruz people and Erwin people? As long as Brando became her student, he would definitely side with Cruz. After all, Erwin was too young to be a threat to Cruz. Why didn't she think of this in the beginning? At the same time, Ko Hua in the dark was also full of anxiety. She originally wanted to get rid of the weakest among Veronica, Mephisto, and Brando, but she never dreamed that Brando would give her such a big surprise. "You hid your strength." In her opinion, this was the only reason. It was impossible for a young man in his 20s to have such terrifying combat experience. She saw the shadows of those who had fought with her in the past in Brando. Although he was not as terrifying as the Dark Dragon Odin, the Dragon of Fury, or the Crystal, he was almost as powerful as the demigods in the Twilight War. In human terms, he was a demigod. She thought about it, and there was only one possibility. It could be that her old opponents from the ancient times, disguised as humans, came to find trouble with her. This idea was easy to understand. Since she could recover, why couldn't others? The gods were far away, but there were still many powerful existences who were not gods. The most famous of them were probably the Dark Dragon Odin and the Azure Knight. Thinking of this, Ko Hua's face changed. Her bright hair fluttered in the wind and she screamed angrily, "You are definitely not an iron person. You are a divine person." "Who are you?" "Divine person?" Brando finally woke up from Ko Hua's roar. He had already finished off all his opponents and helped Hipamera out. The cleric girl was almost in a desperate situation in the previous battle. Her combat level was not as good as the Shire's, and the siege of the three blazing wings almost made her breathless. She had several wounds on her body and her robe was torn. It was not easy for her to catch her breath. She took a deep breath and thanked Brando from a distance. "Thank you, Sir Lord." Brando looked at his battered and exhausted subordinates and was a little annoyed. However, Ko Hua's words still attracted his attention. What was a divine person? Was Odin a divine person? Was the Azure Knight a divine person? Odin had once told him that they did have some noble blood flowing in their bodies. Brando could guess that they might be descendants of a divine person, but they were not pure-blooded divine person. He had always been curious about the relationship between the divine person and the gods. In a literal sense, the divine person seemed to be the people of the gods. There was a mainstream school of thought in Wonde that believed that the divine person was the first generation of inhabitants of Wonde. They were the servants of the gods, and then there was the golden generation and the silver generation. But from the description of the Pale poem, the divine person should at least be on an equal footing with Martha or the gods, because the first paragraph of the Pale poem wrote that the divine person and Martha weaved this world together. And now, Ko Hua's words had a different meaning. She must know that the gods would not walk the earth anymore. She also said that she was the only awakened god in Wonde, but she berated him for not being an iron person, but a divine person. Although it sounded like a slip of the tongue in a fit of anger, Brendel keenly grasped the flaw in it, and Corfa must have understood it. A divine person was not a god. Then what was a divine person? Brando actually had a suspicion for a long time. A divine person was very likely a planeswalker, the legendary manager. If that was the case, then everything barely made sense. There was only one doubt left. Why did Odin and the Azure Knight only call themselves descendants of the divine person, and not directly call themselves divine person? After all, they were genuine planeswalkers. Was it modesty? Or was there something else they were hiding? And Brando faintly felt that his strange system might have some kind of connection with this puzzle. He simply raised his head and smiled mockingly at Ko Hua. "Ko Hua, this has nothing to do with the divine person. It's just that the junk you released is too weak. If you want to talk about divine person, aren't there a few here?" He looked at Mephisto and Veronica meaningfully. The two of them had just disposed of all the blazing wing messengers, and even the Shire had dismantled the two blazing wing messengers that were fighting against him. Although the Shire's strength was at the same level as Hipamera's, his combat experience was far from what the latter could compare to. "Don't play dumb," Corfa was fooled as expected and replied coldly, "I'm not talking about your mediocre strength but your combat instincts. Don't you think you're being a little too pretentious? An elemental activated insect with the combat instincts of a commander level." Commander level combat instincts. Brando caught another term. He knew very well where his combat instincts came from. It was the experience of a level 130 warrior. The growth rate of a player's ability was far faster than that of an NPC. A level 130 warrior was almost equivalent to a few hundred years of combat experience for the NPCs or even more. He knew very well that the pure combat ability of his era had probably surpassed that of William of this era. In other words, he was indeed close to the divine realm, but there was still a long way to go before he had the power to exist. Can commander-level combat instincts prove that I'm a divine person? Brando deliberately smiled contemptuously. Of course not, but are you a divine person? Are you Alphonse, Crystal, or Blazing? Ko Hua's sneer echoed throughout the space. She felt that she had completely seen through Brando's disguise. At the same time, she gritted her teeth in hatred. No wonder this guy saw through her weakness at a glance. She did not believe that the Iron Person of this era had knowledge and memories about the ancient era, about the gods. Even the Silver Person could not. Brando finally understood. In other words, in Ko Hua's view, a commander-level strength was either a divine person or a divine person. There was no other possibility. He also remembered that Ko Hua was also a commander-level monster in the Dusk Camp. And the commander-level existence that she spoke of was likely to be an existence corresponding to them on the side of Order, which was an opponent of the same level as her. Brando estimated that according to Cruz's mythological classification, it was about the strength of a demigod or above. Brando suddenly began to feel that it was interesting. It was the first time that he was so close to the inside story of the chaotic era in the game. He knew very well that the story, quests, and rewards of the game story about that era were mostly outrageous. Because no matter if it was an item or a skill, as long as it was labeled with the prefix ancient, it was a symbol of extreme awesomeness. Just like Flash Strike Sword Art and Nine Luminary Sword Art, these things were products of recent ancient times. And with the Battle of Babel Fortress as a dividing line, the history before that was called Before the Era, which referred to the myths and legends before the chaotic era. And in the game, there was only one kind of item that players came into contact with before the era: the War Slate. But just this was enough to drive everyone crazy. Where are you from? Ko Hua suddenly asked. 11, 12, or 17? What did these numbers mean? Brando was a little confused, but he did not show it on his face and pretended that he had been exposed. He smiled bitterly and said, no comment. But he did not expect that dark Ko Hua, who had almost completely turned into lightning, suddenly quieted down and stared coldly at him with his silver-white eyes. Strange, you are not a celestial. What are you? You are the F***king thing. Brando cursed, but he did not expect that the other party's attitude would change 180 degrees. Thinking back, the problem could only be with that set of numbers. But no matter how hard he racked his brain, he couldn't figure out what the connection was, and Corfa certainly wouldn't answer his similar questions again. At this time, Veronica and Mephisto finally came to his side. Brendel, what are you playing at? Veronica was the first to ask. But Brendel felt that the way she looked at him was a little strange. It was like a little girl who wanted a toy but could not get it. He could not help but feel a chill down his spine. What kind of strange idea is she up to again? He hurriedly replied, yes. I don't know what she is talking about, Lady Veronica. I just wanted to get some information out of her. You're following her words? Veronica realized what was going on. Brando nodded. Their conversation was naturally seen by Ko Hua. Although the eldest daughter of Ekis had expected it, she was still furious. With her status and knowledge, she was fooled by an iron folk. Of course, she didn't know that Brendel's experience was more eccentric, and his knowledge might not be as good as hers. But in Corfa's eyes at this moment, Brendel was just a bug, and now the truth was in front of her eyes. She was deceived by a bug. And it was in front of her sister. If she still had a physical body, her face would have turned red and white. Her embarrassment and anger finally turned into a thunderous roar. You will pay the price, mortals? It was as if the entire space trembled. Everyone present turned around and found that dark Ko Hua was bathed in a snow-white brilliance. Hundreds and thousands of lightning bolts as thick as an arm interweaved from all directions and merged into her body. Seeing this, Brando was the first to react. Divine barrier. The divine barrier has disappeared. That guy is going to fight personally. Sure enough, in the next moment, an invisible barrier shattered like glass around Ko Hua. Before it shattered, one could barely see that it was a complete sphere. Then, in the blink of an eye, it dissipated into the air. In an instant, lightning gathered on Ko Hua's body, forming a bright electric ball. Corfa, on the other hand, was like a butterfly in a cocoon, completely wrapped in this electric ball. Her body had become vaguely visible, but her eyes had become 1,000 times brighter. Divine power sublimation. Shido, who watched this scene unfold, could not help but mutter to herself, Divine power sublimation, this is divine power sublimation. What's that? Haruz turned around and asked, puzzled. But Miss Scholar was obviously stunned, and did not hear his question at all. Corfa, who was behind him, smiled at the little prince, her eyes reflecting the bright brilliance of the lightning below, and replied, according to your words, it is to ignite the divine fire. The originally weak flame called divine power was ignited. At first it was just a flame, but it gradually became a raging flame. Milo's remaining divine power was like a seed, but at this moment, this seed had taken root and sprouted in Kohua's body. Even Brando could feel an irresistible aura being born in the entire space, causing everything in this space to groan and scream in turmoil. There seemed to be visible ripples in the air, and some indescribable things were gathering from all directions, merging into the electric ball where Kohua was. Kohua's dark soul was resonating with the entire holy cathedral of the hibernator. No, Milos's body. Brando suddenly understood what those things that merged into the electric ball were. It was order, law, the power of the domain. That was Milos's divine title. His face changed and he hurriedly shouted to the others, be careful, she and Milos are even closer together. So this is the power of order. Kohua's voice changed. The arrogant, conceited and cold voice from before seemed to have disappeared, leaving only this thunder-like, majestic, queen-like voice. Brando could already tell that this voice was very close to Milo's voice, but this was a woman's voice. Order and chaos intertwine and coexist like light and shadow and are not meaningless. Kohua raised her arm in the electric cocoon. However, these things that are eternal and unchanging do not belong to you mortals. Let me clear the obstacles for Milos and rebuild this world. She proudly raised her chin and spread her 5 fingers. Accept your judgment. Hundreds of blazing white lightning beams rose from behind Kohua in front of Brando and the other's shocked eyes, like a white peacock spreading its tail. But after those beams formed a huge fan and separated, they suddenly turned in midair and stabbed at everyone in the hall. Chapter 833. The sky was filled with crisscrossing blazing white rays of light. It was like a rain of light, hitting the platform, the blazing magic power transmission pipes, or passing by Brando, Veronica and Mephistopheles, or hitting the magic shield that the Shire General was about to open, stirring up layers of violent vibrating ripples on it. Hippamera dodged to the edge of the platform with difficulty, but a beam of light still shattered the sacrificial staff in her hand in front of her astonished gaze. Others shot in the direction of Cruz's eldest son, turning the ice cave into a honeycomb. Large and small pieces of ice fell from the sky, smashing into Shido and Haruz, who were holding their heads and screaming. The first layer of light had not yet faded, and the second layer of light was generated along the path of the previous layer of light. They were like lines drawn with milky white paint on a dark canvas, scattering in the center of the platform like countless snakes, scattering towards everyone present. Brendel, that's the hunter's siblings. Veronica suddenly realized what was going on. Brando was startled, and then his expression changed drastically. They had been entangled with Kohua and her minions before, and the battle had nothing to do with Peya and Yeruda. But this time Kohua launched an indiscriminate attack, and the hunter siblings themselves were only a little stronger than ordinary people, not to mention that they were still unconscious. If they were hit, it would be a disaster. But the problem was that no one had thought of this problem before, and now each of them was a considerable distance away from the hunter siblings. And the white lightning was already in front of them. Brando was full of regret and could only watch the tragedy unfold in front of him. He still remembered that he had promised Peya to protect her and her brother, and the words were still in his ears. But the first beam of light hit a place very close to Peya, melting into a bright red dot on the platform, and the second beam adjusted its direction and stabbed straight at the hunter girl's chest. It was at this time that a holy light shield unexpected by everyone fell from the sky, enveloping the hunter siblings in it and blocking the attack for them. She was Hippamera, the only one present who could use divine spells. Brando reacted, but he had a bad feeling in his heart. He looked back and saw that the priestess girl had thrown away her shattered staff. She didn't even care about herself and first opened a shield for Peya and Yeruda who were lying on the platform. Protect yourself. Be careful. Brando knew the price Hippamera would have to pay. A beam of light pierced through her left arm, and Hippamera screamed in pain. Her body swayed slightly, and then a beam of light pierced through her lower abdomen. Woo! The young girl bit her lips and let out a low cry. Blood spurted out like a fountain and she rolled on the platform covered in blood. Hippamera. Brando was furious, but another beam of light swept toward him. He had no choice but to turn around and hide under a row of magic power transmission pipes, letting dozens of light beams hit it and create sparks. The county. Brando went around to the bottom of the pipe, untied a bottle from his belt, and threw it to his wizard attendant not far away. Pass it over. The county hurriedly turned the shield in another direction, but the light beams still hit it with a buzzing sound, rolling up layers of waves on the cyan light shield. He caught the bottle, weighed it, and immediately guessed that it should be holy water number 13. Veronica was waving her sword like a mirror, deflecting the light one by one, but when she looked up, her cyan eyes had already reflected the third wave of crisscrossing white lines rising behind Ko Hua. At this time the entire space was filled with incandescent lightning. Little one, Mephistopheles, we have to think of something. We can't let her attack as she pleases. She also felt troubled. My lord, I'm also having some trouble here. The county was also full of anxiety, but the light beams shooting at them were like torrential rain, making it impossible for him to move his feet. Of course this could not go on. Ko Hua had Milos as an endless source of energy, and they would be exhausted to death. Brando pondered for a moment, then raised his head and shouted to his teacher above him. Teacher, can you think of a way to attack Ko Hua so that she can't concentrate on attacking us? Among the 5 of them, only Mephistopheles had the strength to launch a counterattack. Mephistopheles immediately rushed towards Ko Hua. For a moment, countless white light beams flew towards him, but every white line that came to the Ash Sword Saint's side was reflected by a gray reflective surface that appeared out of nowhere. The denser the white lines were, the more frequent the reflections were. The Ash Realm surrounded Mephistopheles, and for a moment, it was like a sparkling wave of light. The Ash Sword Saint seemed to have forcibly torn a crack in the white lightning and explosions, which made Ko Hua jump in fright. Damn it, damn it. She screamed angrily, and hurriedly redirected most of her attacks towards Mephistopheles. In this way the pressure on Brando and Veronica was greatly reduced. But the price was that Mephistopheles had to temporarily retreat, and his power of order was greatly depleted. At this time the county finally had the time to raise his shield and rush towards Hippamera. The white light beams were like tracers hitting his shield. On the platform, there were even stray bullets that hit Hippamera, who was trying to get up again. The girl's shoulder exploded into a blob of blood, and with a cry she lay completely in a pool of blood. The county rushed over to drag the county back, but no matter how hard he tried, he was always a hair's breadth away. Ko Hua seemed to have seen through their intentions, and mobilized a relatively high density of attacks to stop the county's next move. The shield in the county's hand was flickering, and the magic power consumption was astonishing. Gradually, sweat appeared on his forehead. If this continued, he would have to retreat to the bottom of the pipe. Of course, Brando saw the predicament, and could not help but be anxious. At this time he could not care less, and at this time he shouted, "The county, quickly raise your shield and face me." The county was slightly stunned. Quickly. Brando was very anxious. My lord. You can't take the risk. Hippamera's intermittent voice suddenly came from the soul, and she seemed to be enduring great pain as she whispered, I haven't been following you for long, give up on me. What do you mean by long? Do you think I'm a merchant? Brando stared at the county. Quickly, this is an order. The county smiled bitterly and did not face Brando with the shield. Instead, he extended the edge of the shield for a while, and now it could also cover the direction Brando was facing. That's more like it. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Charles replied, but don't just focus on saving the damsel in distress and get me into trouble, my lord. Nonsense, don't you want to save her? The county shrugged. I'll cover you. My lord. Mr. the county. Hippamera was lying in a pool of blood and murmured. Brando naturally did not stop for a moment. He directly launched Flash Strike Sword Art and slashed at the county. Buzz, with a soft sound, the county's shield flashed more violently than ever before. He could not help but cry out in shock, My lord, do you want to kill me? Shut up. Brando of course knew that his troublesome attendant was joking with him, but he was not in the mood now. He withdrew his sword from the county's shield, and in a flash he had already arrived beside Hippamera. The cleric girl was so miserable that he could hardly bear to look at her. There was not a spot on her body that was not stained with blood. Brando secretly hated Ko Hua's heavy-handed attack. At the same time he hugged Hippamera's soft body. At this time a white light swept towards him. He had to carry Hippamera and roll to the edge of the platform. He looked down from the edge and was pleasantly surprised to find that there were a few pipes that could hide people. Brando hurriedly jumped down from there and then put Hippamera on top of the pipe. He carefully lifted her head, but he was immediately stunned because he saw Hippamra's blood-stained face. The girl's eyes were closed, her face was pale, and her dry lips were trembling slightly. She seemed to be very scared. Only then did he understand how much courage it took for her to say those words. His heart softened and he patted her back to reassure her. Then he took out a bottle of number 13 holy water, and let her open her mouth, and then he fed her little by little. After a while, Hippamra's eyelashes moved and she opened her eyes, but there was only guilt in her sea-blue eyes. "I'm sorry, my lord, Enough, you've done well enough," Brando replied. In any case, for a girl who was only at the beginning of gold tier and had not been on the battlefield, her performance could be said to be perfect. And the key was courage. Brando knew that Hippamra's courage came from her loyalty to him. He also did not know why this girl's loyalty to him seemed to be more devout than the others. It was like a believer's obedience to her God. He could only think that it might be a problem with the card and character settings, but even so, it was enough to move him. "Have a good rest and leave the rest to us." Hippamra's face was full of unwillingness and she bit her lip. Although Brando said to leave the rest to us, in fact he was not confident. Ko Hua's attack at this stage was a bit ridiculous. Even Mephisto could not block it. His strength was second only to the sage. He gently put Hippamra down again and then looked up. The space was intertwined with electric arcs and explosions. Ko Hua was at the center of the entire platform, easily manipulating countless white lines to attack everyone. Suddenly there was a scream above his head. Brando heard Haru's voice and his heart tightened. He knew that there was no time to delay. He must pose a threat to Ko Hua's body. "I can only take the risk." Brando patted the edge of Haoran Gaia. In the intertwining white light, dark Ko Hua felt the energy in her body increasing exponentially. She could not help but squint her eyes. There was an illusion in her heart. As long as she waved her hand, everything in front of her could be turned into ashes. This feeling of being in control of everything was too good. Even in her heyday before the new era, she had never experienced such a wonderful pleasure. So this was the feeling of being a god in the world of order. She licked her lips and began to like this feeling a little. Although there were only some insects in front of her, but controlling lightning for her own use, and using this power of nature to destroy everything, it felt good. She was still at ease, but the people in front of her were already struggling. At this moment, the images appeared once again around her. Perkins had already turned into a sea of flames, and the next city was 10 Arms City. A virtual hourglass was currently counting down in the sky above the city. The next time the hourglass was filled with energy, it would be the end of the city. Destruction to dark Ko Hua was a kind of pleasure. She could not help but laugh out loud. Like the shrill laughter of a demon, it echoed in the space. Mephisto and Veronica were both livid, but no one noticed that it was at this time below the platform that Brando had already disappeared. Haruz leaned against the ice wall with a pale face, as if he was very cold and shivered. Miss Scholar was so anxious that she was about to cry. She had covered the little prince with all the spare clothes in her backpack, but the latter's body temperature was still dropping rapidly. There was a large pool of blood behind him and blood was still gushing out of his chest. Am I going to die? No, absolutely not. By the way, Haruz, do you look like your sister? Shido, under Lenoret's signal, kept diverting the little prince's attention so that he could stay awake. Haruz shook his head weakly. Really? Shido was a little skeptical. I don't believe she is more beautiful than you. Haruz wanted to cry but he could not. He was a man. Miss Shido, I'm a little, not happy at all when you say that. Who are you? At this time, the voices of Lorena and her husband, who had been guarding outside the cave, came in. Of course, it was mainly Philas's shouting voice. Then there was a muffled groan and the sound of fighting. The eldest prince immediately frowned and looked in that direction. Soon they saw Lorena supporting the injured Philas back. Shido looked up and her face changed immediately. She saw a group of black-robed knights pouring in from the outside. All for one. Her vision was sometimes clear and sometimes blurry. Scarlet suddenly remembered an experience of encountering a pack of wolves in the mountains, which seemed to be the scene in front of her. However, in the dark mountains, the bright moon was in the sky, and the howls of wolves rose and fell one after another. The wolves were like shadows in the forest, one after another, appearing all around. Wolves were cunning and cruel when they moved in groups, just like the crew's nobles who were approaching in shadows. They seemed to be winking at each other, like a pack of wolves trying to outflank the jungle, growling and baring their white fangs. Scarlet shook her head in a daze, and in a trance, she realized that it was the gleaming long sword in the hands of the noble soldiers. The crew's people were surrounding her again. Scarlet barely kept her eyelids half open. She saw the young man with a crossbow not far away seem to be persuading her, but his voice was humming far and near at the same time, and she could not hear him clearly, and the other party's expression seemed to be exaggerated without limit. He sometimes smiled, revealing rows of neat teeth which made her shudder. Just like that, a long while passed. She saw a man coming towards her, close to her. She gritted her teeth and stepped back, only to find that she was powerless to resist. "My lord." Scarlet's heart was in distress. She suddenly felt afraid that she would never see her lord again. She was so scared that she almost trembled. Her face was covered with a layer of gray, and tears flowed down her face uncontrollably. At this time, a cold blade was placed on her neck, and then she felt a sharp pain on her scalp. Someone grabbed her hair and pulled her head up. She had no choice but to look at the person. Her vision was very dim, as if she was in a daze. She could barely see that there was a long scar on the person's face, and he was looking at her with a somewhat playful gaze. A female monkey in the forest. "Hey, what do you mean by that look?" In her daze, the other party laughed and said. Scarlet seemed to be stung, and she struggled with all her might. The man shouted angrily, grabbed her head, and slammed her against the ice wall behind her. The mountain maiden felt her vision go dark, and she coughed heavily. Then she heard a series of scolding. The young man seemed to be loudly reprimanding his companions, but Scarlet did not feel any sense of security. She just wanted to curl up and provide herself with a sense of protection. But the man pulled her hair and turned her face, and then patted her face with his hand as if he was saying something to her. Something about Veronica, the Pahiru family, conspiracy, treason, Her Majesty the Empress, and so on. In between, he seemed to mention the Lord's name. Scarlet trembled and tried hard to hear what the other party was saying, but the voice seemed to be getting weaker, as if it came from the horizon. She felt her eyelids getting heavier, and waves of sleepiness came over her. After the man finished asking, he stopped and looked at her. But she was a little confused. Then there was a heavy slap to the face, and she felt that half of her face was numb and swollen. She could not open her eyes and could only squint slightly. But she still gritted her teeth and stared at those people. At that moment, as if she was enlightened, Scarlet understood that the other party's target was not her. They wanted to deal with the Lord and Lady Veronica. This was like a conviction that was injected into Scarlet's heart, and made her sober a little. In her vision that had become abnormally narrow, she saw the young man called Babarn pull away the person who was interrogating her, and then the two of them had a fierce argument. "No. I must inform the Lord." This was the only thought in the mountain maiden's mind in a daze. But at this time, a voice seemed to have drilled into the depths of her heart. "Scarlet, I remember that is your name, right?" Chapter 834. The Black Knight creaked as he walked on the ice and filed in. Lorena, Faraz, Lenarette, and Shido raised their hands one by one, each with a black crystal-like long sword resting on their necks. The sword-wielding Black Knight had a long black velvet cloak and an expressionless face, like a golem made by a wizard. The ice cave was a mess, and the crisscrossing sword marks on the ice proved the fierce battle that had taken place before. The Black Knight dragged the bodies of two of their people out, leaving a dark red mark on the ice. One of the particularly tall Black Knight came to Ko Hua, and the girl looked back with her pale silver eyes without fear, but she could only see a pair of particularly bright eyes under the shadow of the other party's hood, as well as the thin lower half of his cheeks. The Black Knight stared at Ko Hua's snow-white neck for a while, as if considering whether to put his sword there. "Please step aside," Ko Hua said in a crisp voice. "Miss Ko Hua." The knight put his hand on his chest and bowed slightly to Ko Hua, the heavy armor rubbing against the chainmail below making a clattering sound of metal colliding. "Are you going to do to me what you did to them?" Ko Hua glanced at Shido, who was biting her lower lip in fear, and asked calmly. "I wouldn't dare." The knight replied with his head lowered. Ko Hua smiled slightly. She knew that these people were believers of the dusk, and they respected her mostly because of her sister. Perhaps they thought that was Ekis' eldest daughter, the leader of the monsters of the Dusk Legion. If mortals worshipped gods and Martha, then these people's fanatical idols included Darkness Ko Hua. Although she was simple-minded, she couldn't help but sigh in her heart, understanding that they just wanted to believe the truth that they were willing to believe. "Then I beg you to let them go, okay?" she asked softly. "I'm afraid not." "Aren't you guys afraid that I'll get angry?" "I'll tell my sister." Ko Hua's face hardened. Ko Hua-sama won't blame us for this. These people, he turned around to look, are all your enemies. I will not fight with anyone. They are not my enemies. At least it belongs to your sister, right, our little princess? The knight's lips curled up. Ko Hua shut her mouth. She glanced at the trembling Shido and said, then at least let her go. She's just a child, she's no threat to you. The knight turned around and nodded. The black knight beside Shido sheathed his sword, and the scholar slowly slid to the ground as if paralyzed. She then burst into tears. The knight frowned and glanced outside. However, the battle outside was still going on fiercely, and no one was paying attention to the noise here. He breathed a sigh of relief, then turned back to Ko Hua and said, please stay here, Miss Ko Hua. Ko Hua glanced at him, neither answering yes nor no. She just stepped back and sat down. She looked at the crying Shido and gave her a comforting look. The latter looked at her gratefully, and her sobs gradually subsided. The knight nodded with satisfaction. He raised his right hand and gestured to his colleagues. A small team of black knights with longbows came up from behind. They passed by the knight's position and cautiously approached the entrance of the cave. Aruz watched this scene in a daze. When he saw the black knight approaching the entrance of the cave, he suddenly realized what they were going to do. He suddenly panicked and opened his mouth, pretending to shout. But before he could do that, 2 feet suddenly appeared in front of him. He raised his head and saw the knight looking down at him. If I were you, your highness, I would keep my mouth shut. What is he doing? The little female dragon and Medisha lay side by side under an ice crevice. Not far from them, Arek was limping towards an exit in front. He seemed to be seriously injured, and every time he dragged his feet for a while, he had to stop to rest. He now looked more like a beggar than a duke. His fluffy silver-gray hair was messy, the wrinkles on his forehead were tightly knitted together, his face was gray, oily, and sweaty. His chest rose and fell rapidly like a broken bellows. He rested for a while, then struggled to get up with the wall and continued to walk forward. But he didn't go far before he fell on the slippery and cold ground. He struggled to crawl for a distance, then stopped again. This time, Alaz and Medisha watched him stop for a long time, at least a quarter of an hour, before he sat up dejectedly. After a moment of silence, he stood up shakily and continued to walk in the direction of the exit. He seems to be going somewhere. Where? I don't know. He seems to know the way here. Alaz and Medisa looked at each other and nodded. Then they climbed up from the bottom of the ice crevice and sneakily followed him. Arek did not notice that he was being followed. After he walked out of the exit, he continued to move in a certain direction along the winding paths and corridors. He seemed to be familiar with this place. Every time he encountered a fork in the road, he only hesitated for a moment, and then chose the direction. Medisha used to be the commander of the Silver Elves and had a strong sense of direction. After a few times, she judged that Arek should be heading north. Not long after, the traces of man-made buildings in front of Arek disappeared. What appeared in front of Arek was a naturally formed glacier crack. Alaz and Medisha saw him resting for a moment at the entrance of the glacier. He took out something from under his clothes and took 2 bites, chewing with difficulty. Alaz's eyes were sharp and saw that it was probably a piece of jerky. He's replenishing his strength, she said with some excitement. This means that we should be reaching the destination soon. He didn't do this before. Why is he replenishing his strength? Medisha was a little puzzled. Who knows? Alaz was as carefree as ever. Let's follow him and find out. Should we restrain him first? Medisha thought for a moment and felt a little uneasy. No, Alaz shook her head. What if we're not there yet? This guy is very stubborn. He definitely won't lead the way for us. The Silver Elf Princess thought about it and agreed, so she nodded. Just as the two were talking, the Duke had already wolfed down the food in his hand. He took out a handful of snow-white powder from his pocket and held it in his hand for a moment. Then he frowned and swallowed it with difficulty. Alaz and Medisha both saw clearly that it was snow. Arek must have preserved it in the ice crevice earlier. Fortunately, the temperature of the ice layer did not melt it. But this further confirmed Alaz's guess. After drinking the snow water, Arek coughed twice at the top of his voice, obviously a little unbearable. But he still stood up slowly and without much hesitation, walked directly into the glacier step by step. Seeing this scene, Alaz was excited again. She hurriedly waved at Medisha and the 2 girls followed behind her. The glacier was very long and narrow with a faint blue light. After walking for a short while, Alaz suddenly turned around and patted Medisha on the shoulder. Medisha, do you hear something? In the dark environment, her golden eyes were particularly bright and sparkling. Medisha glanced at her and nodded. Thanks to her long pointed ears, the elf's hearing was very outstanding. She had already heard the sound from the other side of the glacier. It's lightning. That means we're in the right place, Alaz replied with a little excitement. He must have some tricks up his sleeve. But Lady Martha is obviously on our side. He's dead meat. Medicia's expression was a little strange. She looked at Alaz and showed some anxiety. Anyway, let's go quickly. Sister Alaz, I'm worried that we'll be late. What's wrong? What are you worried about? I think I heard the voice of the Lord. What? The exit on the other side of the glacier was located on top of the cliff. Outside the exit, there was a deep gorge about 20 to 30 meters long. At this moment outside the gorge, lightning seemed to have weaved into a terrifying storm, wreaking havoc in the entire gorge. And because of the gorge, it was difficult to see the exit in this direction from the platform where Ko Hua was in the dark. On the contrary, standing at the exit, Arek could see the situation below. His pale, skeleton-like claws were clasped tightly on the ice. With a cold face, he looked down at the fierce battle between Veronica, Mephisto, the Shire, Brando, and the others in Ko Hua. A cold smile appeared on his pale face, as if the previous depression had been swept away at this moment. But suddenly he felt his heart beating violently again. He hurriedly pressed his hand to his chest, his face full of cold sweat, as if he was receiving instructions. He nodded cautiously, nodded again, shook his head again, then frowned and finally nodded again. I understand, Lord Ko Hua. Yes. Finally, he muttered these two words as if to himself. Alaz and Medicia, who were hiding behind the crisscrossing cracks on the glacier, saw him pull out a dagger from his boot, and then began to carve and draw on the ice. After a short while, they saw clearly that he was drawing a circular magic circle. It should be Ko Hua who summoned him here. No wonder he could distinguish the maze-like path below, Medicia said in realization. Sister Alaz, can you recognize what magic circle he is drawing? It seems to be a channeling magic circle. A channeling magic circle? Medicia saw the critical situation below and was nervous. She could not wait to summon her unicorn and fly down to fight side by side with Brando. But fortunately she still knew what was more important. The Lord had not discovered a wreck at this place at all. It was easy to block an attack in the open but difficult to block an arrow in the dark. She had to restrain a wreck. You have seen those large-scale magic circles such as the war teleportation circle of the Silver Elves. Large-scale magic circles cannot be activated by a person's magic alone. This kind of channeling magic circle is a kind of ritual circle that automatically gathers magic to activate the large-scale magic circle. Allah's eyes flashed with golden flames. She licked her sharp canine teeth with her tongue. I understand. Cruz's door of flame, the stolen materials must be on him. Ko Hua wants him to open the portal here and summon the demons to fight for her. We must not let him succeed. Medicia could not help but blurt out. Of course. The little female dragon sneered and nodded proudly. If she had a tail, it would be in the sky now. Arek panted as he finished drawing the first circle. However, for a large teleportation portal like the Door of Flame, one channeling circle was definitely not enough. He wiped off his sweat and walked to the side shakily, ready to start drawing the second circle. But it was at this time he saw a pair of shoes. To be exact, it was a pair of light brown calfskin boots. The tips of the boots were inlaid with iron and silver-plated. He was very familiar with this pair of boots, because it was the owner of this pair of boots who took the heart of the dragon from him. He would never remember it wrong. He suddenly froze there. Keep drawing. The little female dragon's voice was smiling. Why did you stop drawing? I think your magic circle is not bad. Arek suddenly trembled as if he was possessed. He roared and pounced on Alaz. But the latter did not move, just looked at him with a smile. Before he could take 2 steps, he saw that his foot was tripped by something and fell solidly on the ice. Arek screamed and then he felt something on his neck. He did not need to look back to know what it was, because he had already seen the long silver shuttle on his cheek. Human, do you feel very regretful now? The little female dragon was very proud. She simply put the star-shaped stone on the ground, then sat on it and looked down at the battered Arek and said with a smile, but you can rest assured your life will not be in danger for the time being. I will use you to make a deal. Let's see what Brando will do now. The little female dragon was proud, but Medicia was not as optimistic. In fact, the little silver elf princess called out with some concern, Sister Alaz, what's wrong? Look over there. What? Is that the Black Knight over there? After Brando settled Hippamera, he did not directly return to the platform, but went around the crisscrossing pipes under the platform to the back of Dark Ko Hua. He knew that Ko Hua had automatically removed the divine barrier at this time, although her attack power had increased by 1,000 times, but her defense was greatly reduced. After all, the opponent was not a true god, and there was no real absolute gap in the true sense. And at this time, Dark Ko Hua finally realized that there was one less person on the battlefield in front of her. She subconsciously looked back, but only saw the moment Brando's figure disappeared in that direction. At that moment she instinctively felt danger. As if subconsciously, the dense lightning quickly converged from the front half of the platform to the back half of the platform. Although even Ko Hua herself could not tell why she felt that Brando, who had just elemental activation, was more dangerous than the Sword Saint in the ultimate domain above her head, but after all, she was once a demigod, and now she had Milos's domain and priesthood. Her perception was 1,000 times sharper, and her premonitions were 1,000 times more accurate. Most gods believed in their own premonitions, just like how Martha could see the twilight of the gods and the world at the beginning of the creation of the world. The dense white light beams converged together like a wall of electricity, crackling and hitting the platform, forming dozens of dazzling golden lines in the entire back half of the platform, as if even the platform was about to melt. But these crisscrossing lightning bolts could not stop Brando. Everyone saw that Brando's figure was like a ghost, disappearing and reappearing continuously. The lightning passed through his figure, like passing through a broken phantom. In an instant he had passed through the storm of lightning and arrived in front of Ko Hua. Previously, when Brando attacked the Shire, no one had noticed the subtle details on the battlefield, but at this moment, it was no longer clear. Flash strike, Veronica almost blurted out. And in the ice cave, Lenoret and Shido could not help but show a look of great surprise. Brando had already slashed his sword at Ko Hua. But at this time Dark Ko Hua breathed a sigh of relief. She stared coldly at Brando's sword that was getting closer and closer to her, and her tone was so cold that it was almost terrifying. The Dragon Clan's skill in manipulating space is also derived from the Twilight Clan, and you dare to show off in front of me. As soon as she finished speaking, countless bolts of lightning interweaved in front of her. It was as if even space itself was trembling, blocking Brando's sword. At that moment Veronica, Lenoret, and Shido were all stunned. The flash strike sword art was blocked. This was almost unimaginable. Flame King Gretel's flash strike sword technique was a sword technique that was worshipped as a god in Kurlutz. Once this technique was passed down from the Dragon Clan, its target would either be hit or dodge in the thousandth of a second after the blade appeared from a crack in space. There was almost no third possibility apart from that. However, right in front of them, the flash strike sword art was interrupted halfway. The space trembling amidst the thunderbolts was akin to the trembling souls of everyone present. What kind of strength was this? However, among all of them, only Brando could maintain his mentality. Although he was slightly surprised, he understood that the flash strike sword art was just a secret skill of the Dragon Clan. In fact, there was still a big gap between the Dragon Clan and the existence of Ekka's daughter. Therefore he was not surprised that Ko Hua had the skill to counter the flash strike sword art. After all, the Dragon Clan and the Twilight Clan were old rivals. But just when everyone thought that he was going to return empty-handed, Brando suddenly retracted the Howran Gaia, and then slashed at Ko Hua again. Again? Dark Ko Hua could not help but laugh in anger when she saw that this guy did not know what was good for him. P.S. This is the first chapter at the end of the week. There will be another chapter around 20 o'clock. I wish everyone a good weekend. Chapter 835. Brando also circled to Ko Hua's side using the flash strike sword art technique, and heard a cold snort in his ear. Ko Hua seemed to have already captured his intentions. Her slender arm moved horizontally in the electric cocoon, turning in his direction. Her 5 fingers spread open, and hot white lines came from all directions, intertwining to form a round shield. Then she turned her head, her silver-white eyes only cold contempt as she looked at Brando with pity. Brando only smiled slightly. Dark Ko Hua was slightly startled and frowned. In Brando's hand, the Howran Gaia's blade was still moving forward. The black blade should have been blocked by the round shield woven by electric light, and it was. When the space trembled violently, the blade could not move an inch forward. But at the same time, everyone saw another scene. The black blade continued to move forward, slashing heavily into Ko Hua's shoulder. The latter screamed and crashed into the platform like a meteor falling to the ground. It was as if 2 events happened independently in 2 parallel worlds, happened separately, and then suddenly intertwined again. In the entire barrel-shaped canyon, the lightning that filled the sky disappeared completely. The white light that traveled in the air seemed to have never existed in this world. The long platform returned to calm, and it was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Dark Kohua got up from the ground and looked at Brando in shock and anger. Her left hand pressed on her snow-white shoulder, and blood kept seeping out from between her fingers. Brando saw this scene and understood that the other party was not a pure energy body. Her state was somewhat similar to Scarlet's, both of them being semi-energy bodies. However, Scarlet's semi-elementalization came from the power of the elements, and the power of Ekis' eldest daughter came from the power of Milos. In that case it was just as he guessed. What just happened? Although the sword was on his neck, Philas did not seem to be afraid at all. He was still whispering to his fiancée. It's the elements. Lorena felt her throat dry. Count Tanagel's elements are. Brando pursed his lips. He was still maintaining the same posture as when he struck the dark Kohua. He floated in the air and looked at the pitiful Kohua. There seemed to be fog lingering around him, but the golden threads of law flashed. Time. Dark Kohua squeezed the word out of his mouth, the most essential thing of all. Miss Kohua, if I'm not wrong, you have no resistance to elemental power, right? Brando smiled and asked with confidence. Dark Kohua's face turned gloomy. She gritted her teeth and stared at Brando, not saying a word. Because your own power hasn't recovered, you're borrowing Milo's power, right? But there's only one kind in the laws of the gods, absolute disparity. So, you have both a priesthood and a domain, but these are just authorities. You can manipulate lightning and even use divine barriers, but those are just Milo's scepters. But before you truly become a god, it's impossible for you to obtain divine laws. So what? Dark Kohua asked in a low voice. Her voice was low, but Brando could hear the nervousness in her heart. If you were Milos, it wouldn't matter, because even if Milos wasn't the father of giants as part of the order, he himself represented some kind of law. Unfortunately, you're a dusk species. Creatures of chaos don't possess any laws. Brando smiled a little indifferently, but in the eyes of Dark Kohua, it was extremely abhorrent. He continued, you should know what I'm going to say. Only laws can fight against laws, because other forces are just dust in the mortal world. In the space, Brando and Kohua's voices rumbled, and Shido was also muttering to herself. You're wrong about one thing. Dark Kohua's face was gloomy as she gritted her teeth and said, there's not only the power of order in this world. Even order itself is just a manifestation of chaos, and chaos is also the top law. Brando nodded. Indeed, in your heyday you naturally wouldn't care about us, but now you've just recovered and you're just wearing Milo's shell. And even this shell has a fatal flaw for you. You must feel that it's a pity. If I had discovered it a little later, you would have been perfect. Dark Kohua was indeed furious. Lightning flashed in her platinum eyes. This was already the second time Brando had seen through her disguise. She didn't understand how he could always find her fatal weakness in the first place, but the repeated provocations finally made her furious. You damn bastard. But she knew that she couldn't do it. This human in front of her was complacent, and it was a perfect opportunity for her. Energy was flowing into her body, and in just a quarter of an hour she would be completely reborn with the help of Milo's body's recovery. At that time these guys in front of her would really be insects. But it was at this time that Dark Kohua felt a little strange. She stared at Brando, who was looking down at her from above, and felt that he should have seen through her thoughts. No, that's impossible. Otherwise, why didn't he do it? She pressed a hand on her shoulder, and a complicated light flashed in her eyes. She thought for a moment and was about to test the other party, but Brando smiled and interrupted her. Are you wondering why I didn't follow up with another attack? Dark Kohua seemed to have been hit in the heart by this sentence. The thing she was most worried about had happened. It's actually very simple. My power is only enough for me to stab with my sword, Brando continued. But fortunately, I'm not the only one here. Brando's words made Dark Kohua's mind flustered. She suddenly felt the hair on her back stand up. She quickly turned her head and saw a gray blade. The blade moved forward silently, bringing along a gray domain as it moved forward quietly, as if it was sucking in all the sounds around it. Gray element. She immediately recognized that it was the attack method of the human sword saint. Although the opponent's element was not as vicious as Brando's time, his strength, the ultimate domain, made her very wary. Just as Brando said, she had no way to resist the power of the law. She had no choice but to roll awkwardly to avoid the Ash Sword Saint's sword. But her dodge proved Brando's words. Kohua herself obviously knew this. When she got up from the platform, her face was as black as iron. Once Mephisto seized the opportunity, Dark Kohua had no chance to summon lightning. Without the shell of Milos's authority, how could she, who had just recovered, be a match for the Ash Sword Saint? In fact, if it weren't for her rich combat experience, she would have been nailed to the platform. Veronica, who saw this scene, turned back with strong curiosity in her eyes. How did you guess? In fact, the reason was very simple. When this dungeon was opened, the players had not yet activated the concept of elemental activation. If the boss in this dungeon could control the elements, then the players of that era would not have been able to win. Only the law can fight against the law, other powers are but dust in the world. This sentence was the title of the chapter on elemental activation, and was also the core of the law of Tiamat. Brando remembered it deeply. And with this preconceived idea, with the result and the deduction process, and observing Dark Kohua's various performances, it was not difficult to find the answer. Previously, it was too easy for Master's Grey Realm to destroy her lightning. The Grey Realm is not a superior law, at least not higher than the lightning element. And Master's strength, compared to her now, is only about the same, so it aroused my suspicion. Brando replied. That's it? Veronica looked a little doubtful. It was not that she had any suspicions, but she instinctively felt that this little guy would not tell her so straightforwardly. That's it. Brando nodded firmly. Veronica was silent for a moment, then shook her head with a bitter smile. Little guy, I really don't know if it was good or bad to let you stay in the loop of trade winds. Although she is not a true god now, the title of a false god can't be wrong. An existence close to a god, but a few words from you have turned her into this. I really don't know what to say about you. Brando smiled and shook his head. The battle is not over yet, Lady Veronica. Kohua is Ekis' eldest daughter, she will not admit defeat so easily. What else can she do? Veronica narrowed her eyes suspiciously. She is not a god yet, only the law can fight against the law. In addition to the priesthood, she has another authority of Milos. Brando stared at Kohua, who was fighting with Mephisto below, and said word by word, "Domain." As if to prove Brando's words, the dark Kohua suddenly screamed in anger. In an instant, a light blue electrostatic field with her body as the center expanded in an instant and shrouded the entire canyon. It was like an expanding ripple, but when this expanding ripple swept across everyone present, everyone felt that their connection with the original world was cut off. The feeling was as if they were still in their original position, and the scenery around them did not change at all, but they felt that they had come to another world. Brando, Mephisto, the Shire, Veronica, and Hippamera, who was lying on the pipe under the platform, felt it the most obvious. This is. The Shire's eyes were a little bright. A world formed by the law of thunder. Veronica closed her eyes and felt it carefully. Although it does not belong to Kohua's law, but it is indeed so, she wants to use Milo's law to offset the advantage of our elements. Brando had already seen through Kohua's trick, or rather, the opponent's means were within his expectations. The third phase has begun, Madame Veronica, the next step is up to you. What third phase? The female commander of the crew's army was a little startled. Nothing, madam, you should be the fastest in this situation, please deal with those pipes. Brando shook his head. I have to help the teacher. You? Veronica looked at him suspiciously. Will it be okay? Brando paused for a moment. Then he replied, it better be okay. The entire space in the canyon was like a prison, completely shrouded in an electrostatic field. Light blue fragments of light floated in the air, and on the platform it was a different scene. Mephisto's Grey Realm no longer had the absolute advantage, but was suppressed by the light blue light to a very small area. He stabbed at Kohua with his sword, and the latter seemed to have regained the ability to fight back. She raised her bloody left hand, and a circle of ripples appeared on her open fingertips. The Grey Sword Saint's sword seemed to have hit the divine barrier again, and stopped in midair. Mephisto frowned slightly. Corphus' counterattack didn't give him the feeling of a shield, but more like it stopped his sword automatically. But the sword was still in his hand, and this feeling was too strange. At this time, Brando landed beside him and stood side by side. What's going on? Mephisto asked. Brando shook his head. He only knew that they should be in Milos's realm, but he had never really come into contact with a god's realm. The only thing he had come into contact with that was probably the law realm that was created after elemental activation to the extreme planes. In the extreme planes, one's own elemental power would be strengthened thousands of times, while the enemy's elemental power would be weakened thousands of times. If possible, everyone would try their best to avoid entering the enemy's domain to fight. Kohua's realm was similar. At least from his point of view, Mephisto's gray realm was greatly suppressed. But what made him feel strange was that Kohua's realm was Milos's, and her own power actually represented chaos before the fusion, which meant that in this realm, her own power would also be suppressed. But now it seemed that she was not suppressed at all. She even floated back to the platform, looking at him with a venomous gaze. What's going on? Brando was a little puzzled because he felt that Dark Kohua's fusion with this realm was very harmonious. But Dark Kohua obviously did not intend to give him a chance to think. His previous performance had made her very wary. She raised her hand and gently pointed at the air in front of her. When Algar's dragon soared in the sky, Jupiter put shackles on their wings after the north wind. From then on, the sky was cut off from these lowly creatures. Pale poem? Brando was slightly startled, not quite understanding what Kohua meant by suddenly reciting this paragraph. He subconsciously turned his head, but saw the Shire, Veronica, and Mephisto standing there stiffly, as if time had been frozen, motionless. Brando's expression changed drastically, and he suddenly realized what Dark Kohua was doing, word of truth. But what kind of word of truth could make an existence of the ultimate realm, a sword saint at the peak of the law, submit in an instant? Word of truth itself was just a manifestation of the law. Logically speaking, as long as one stepped into the elemental activation, this spell would basically have no effect. But Kohua's current actions had clearly subverted Brando's understanding. Word of truth? How can you still move? The two opened their mouths to question each other at the same time. But Kohua's eyes suddenly flashed with a light and she reacted. So that's how it is. You really are a divine. I know who you are. She paused for a moment and replied gloomily, Odin, I'm right. You've got the wrong person. Brando replied with a straight face. What a joke, with so many people around, how could he admit it? It doesn't matter if you don't admit it. Kohua snorted coldly, but you can't fool anyone. Only a divine has such authority, and can even ignore the domain of the gods. But unfortunately, Odin and the other bastard bloodlines as the last generation can bully mortals, but it's meaningless in a battle of our level. Very soon, you will understand that in my world only my rules exist. Brando was slightly startled, but the former had already pointed her finger at him and shouted, Alphonse once saw everything with his own eyes in the final battle. On the battlefield of Babel, when thousands of troops rushed towards him, he understood that an era was over. It was Pale Poem again. But this time Brando was already alert. He immediately took a step back and clenched Haurangaya tightly. But it was at this moment that a miracle happened. He found that he was still standing on the platform, but he felt that the distance between him and Dark Kohua was widening. It seemed that a vast plain was suddenly formed between them. At the end of his vision, there was a towering cliff on the horizon, and Kohua was standing on the cliff looking down at him. And behind her, under the cliff, dense flags were appearing on the plain. Brando recognized the emblems on those flags at a glance. Winter wolves, frost leaves, ice blades, those were the legendary tribes of the frost giants. He seemed to understand what was happening at once. At the end of his vision, the army of frost giants was appearing. He didn't know how to describe what was happening in front of his eyes. The two of them were still on the platform and they could feel it, but what they saw was an army approaching in an instant, thousands of meters away from the Dark Korfa. Although this scene looked very strange, Brando understood that what he saw was probably not an illusion, but a scene that was really happening in this world of lightning. This was Milos's kingdom, the Storm Plain, the hometown of the frost giants. But why could Kohua use Milos's domain? Shouldn't her own law be chaos? P.S. The second chapter has been delivered, begging for some monthly votes. Chapter 836. Dark Kohua sneered proudly, but there was clear anger in her eyes. Amidst the biting cold wind, the dark sky was intertwined with thunder. Flags after flags were whistling as they marched, and the metal dragon head sculpture at the top of the flagpole reflected a faint cold light under the dim light. Milo's frost giants worshipped dragons, which was a tradition since ancient times. Dragon-horned helmets gradually appeared in sight. On the endless plains, in an instant, ancient and powerful songs seemed to be sounding from all directions. Brando looked around and saw enemies on all sides. Ancient spirits, bless me to kill my enemies. Blood soaks the wilderness, cutting through thorns and thorns. The land of the homeland, the dragons droop. Dark clouds cover, stars float in the sky. The scene that greeted his eyes seemed to have come out of a certain period of dusty history before the epic. It was desolate and distant, and the plain was vast and boundless. However, It overlapped with a platform that was no more than 100 meters in radius and suspended above the barrel-shaped abyss. It was like an extended field of vision under a wide-angle lens, which made people feel very strange but also very reasonable. Brando still didn't understand how Ko Hua could fit into Milo's domain so well, as if it was her own. In his imagination, Dim Korfa might use Milos's domain, because although Milos's kingdom would suppress all external laws and elements to the greatest extent, her own chaotic power was still weak due to her recent awakening, so even if it was suppressed, she would still be the one benefiting, and then she could use her superior combat experience to win. But what happened before him was completely beyond his expectations. Dark Ko Hua did summon Milo's kingdom, but in this kingdom, not only was she not weakened, she was like a real king, calling the wind and calling the rain. This was impossible in Brando's eyes, because if she had this ability, why would she put herself in such a difficult situation and even get injured by him? She could have completely controlled the situation from the beginning. Snow began to fall from the dark sky, and the cold rain rolled down Brando's slightly pale cheeks, washing away the scars from the last calamity of wolves. The Frost Giant army sang war songs as they advanced in the rain. Brando didn't move, thinking of a way to break out of this situation. The protruding cliff was like an isolated wolf's fang on the horizon. On the cliff, Ko Hua's expression fell into Brando's eyes. Why is she so angry? Brando seemed to tear open a bright hole in the darkness in front of him, allowing him to grasp that clue. He raised his head in disbelief and looked at Ko Hua. She had destroyed herself. Brando's heart was pounding. There was only one possibility, and that was Korfa had erased her own rules. She had completely destroyed herself and made herself a part of Milo's. Only in this way would she be able to fully integrate into Milo's kingdom. She was no longer the Dark Ko Hua, but she was not Milo's either. Brando suddenly understood who it was, the god who was about to wake up, Surash. She's so cruel. Doesn't this mean she's going to live and die with Milo's? Brando suddenly remembered who had forced her into this desperate situation. That person was him. No wonder the other party was glaring at him with such anger and hatred. This kind of hatred was already irreconcilable. Brando felt very helpless. Why bother? You don't have to fight so hard. But what should I do now? The army of frost giants was approaching. It was not an army that had walked out of history, but a manifestation of the rules of Milo's kingdom. Ko Hua was the supreme king. If she wanted him to die, he had to die. This was already a battle between a mortal and a god. There was an absolute difference. There should still be a chance. Let me think. In this desperate situation, Brando calmed down. Not long after, he suddenly had a wonderful idea. He raised his head, a strange light flashing in his eyes. Then let me give you a chance, Ekis' eldest daughter. He suddenly put down the Howran Gaia and walked towards the army of frost giants. What is he doing? Dark Ko Hua was startled. Her willow leaf-like platinum eyebrows also raised. Is he scared out of his wits? But she was now very afraid of Brando and would never give him a chance. She saw Brando walking towards her. After thinking for a while, she simply let the army of frost giants gather closer together. She did not believe that this army could not stop him alone. No matter what tricks Brando had, as long as she did not give him any chance, then he could only do it in vain. She had already made such a great sacrifice and could not afford to fail again. Caution and carefulness had almost become an instinct of hers. But it was not her character to be helpless. Brando had changed her habits. Thinking of this made her very angry. Brando looked at the army of frost giants gathered in front of him. It would be great if the frost chancina could still use it. Now was the perfect time to use it. Against a military fantasy weapon, even though the frost giants clan army was one of the legendary armies, they probably wouldn't be able to resist such power. But it was a pity that these were all just wishful thinking. What Sabers gave him was a broken frost chancina. God knows how long it would take to repair it. He sighed, and the narrow black crystal on his forehead began to appear. He had no choice but to use the heart of Ekis. On the vast plains, the long howls of wolves rang out. Dark Ko Hua's mind moved slightly. Of course she could tell that it was the sound of wolves. And it was not those inferior beasts. It was her own kind, the wolf clan under the twilight. The mournful howls seemed to foresee the end of the world. The sun, the moon, and the stars would no longer rise. Everything would return to chaos. The wolves were chasing after the world. It was the clan closest to her mother, the black wolves and their male wolves. She looked at Brando with a complicated expression. Brando slowly walked across the plains, like a prophet described in the poems, followed by the wolves. This scene was very strange. As the leader of the Twilight Demons, the first of the 12 daughters of Ekis, she commanded the army of frost giants, which represented the order and God. And the successor of the Dark Dragon, the chosen of Martha, was followed by the Twilight Wolves. At this moment, the two sides of the ancient war seemed to be misplaced. Ko Hua began to feel uneasy. She vaguely felt that this was a sign of something. Those creatures who were born in the ancient order of glory, they declined generation after generation. After a tragic war, they turned into dust and disappeared in history. As for the Black Iron generation that had been eroded by the dark magic, they walked out of the thorns, broke free from ignorance, and ignited their own flame in the wilderness. Behind them, the light of God had disappeared, and in its place was a shadow that even she could not see through. In a trance, Ko Hua suddenly felt that the offensive and defensive positions had changed. Although in the vast plains, compared to the frost giant's army, the human man and his wolves still looked like a drop in the ocean. The wolves were passing through Brando, like a rushing sea. Brando let them form a wedge attack formation. The black wolves, including their male wolves, were far less brave and good at fighting than the frost giants. He only hoped that they would use their excellent impact to open a gap in the frost giant's formation. The wolves began to speed up under his command, and so did the giant army. The ice rain in the sky gradually became denser, forming a scene of strong wind and rain. The two sides that were about to fight were running at full speed in this heavy rain. The next moment, the two armies collided with each other. The average height of the frost giants summoned by Ko Hua was more than 4 meters. The giant wolves, which were the size of horses in the eyes of ordinary people, were similar to ordinary people and gray wolves in the forest. This was the battle between wolves and humans. The two sides of the battle inherited the memories from ancient times. They were not opponents who met for the first time, but old enemies who had fought for nearly 10,000 years. The wolves really tore a gap in the frost giants' formation with their speed advantage, but the obsidian leopards on the periphery evaporated in just a few minutes. They could not even cause any damage to the frost giants. On the contrary, the frost giants only needed to wave their arms to smash them into pieces. The black wolves in the back began to cut in, and the frost giants suffered casualties for the first time. They were knocked back again and again, and some of them were even trampled to death because the formation was too dense. But even so, after the wolves advanced for nearly 100 meters, they were still surrounded. A male wolf came to Brando's side. It had a scar at the corner of its eye, which was from the last battle in the Loop of Trade Winds. There were also burn marks on its fur, which was from the battle in Ampere Seal. This male wolf followed Brando the earliest. Brando could still remember the scene when it came to his side through the black forest. He touched the wolf's cheek and the male wolf obediently lay down. Brando grabbed its mane and sat on its back. Brando raised the Haurangaya again. The male wolf also raised its head and howled majestically. Brando looked up. Ko Hua was only 1,000 meters away from him on the cliff. Even at this distance, he could see the look of shock on her face. It must not be easy for her to slaughter her own kind with her own hands. However, the fact that she had such an expression was enough. It was enough to explain a lot of things. Brando seemed to have eaten a calming pill and patted the male wolf's neck. With a roar, a man and a wolf leaped out of the formation. They reformed the vanguard of the wolf pack, and this vanguard was obviously unstoppable. Under Brando's personal attack, the frost giant's formation melted like snow. Ko Hua saw this scene and suddenly felt extremely angry. The pity in her heart disappeared in an instant. She angrily ordered the frost giants to focus their attacks on Brando. 2 frost giants surrounded him from the left and right. Brando faintly felt that he seemed to have attracted Ko Hua's attention. He swung his sword forward and a faint brilliance came out of the blade. It was a long-range attack. This was a unique ability of the warrior class after elemental activation. Compared to the white raven sword style, it was more powerful, but the consumption was much higher. The brilliance swept across the frost giant's formation like a crescent moon, bringing with it a bloody light. When several frost giants fell to the ground, their light blue hair quickly turned white and gray. Their faces also became wrinkled like skeletons and they died in an instant. This was a typical passive effect of the time elemental activation, a lapse. Ko Hua noticed this detail and her eyes couldn't help but sink a little. After Brando's attack, the disaster for the frost giants was far from over. With a loud bang, the Haurangaya resonated with the ground. A row of rock spikes rose from the ground, and the frost giants on the left were instantly torn apart. This sword was almost full strength. Even Brando couldn't help but feel a little exhausted after using it. But the effect was remarkable. It almost opened a 30-meter deep hole in the frost giant's formation. At the same time he breathed a sigh of relief. These frost giants were not as powerful as he thought. Because it was a rule simulated by Ko Hua, and because they only kept the strength of the Golden Clan's bottom line, it was only about the strength of a lower to middle gold. With his combat strength it was not a very big problem. His experience was increasing rapidly, but Brando wasn't too sure if it was enough to level up to the next level. He didn't have time to pay attention to his interface at all. The male wolf carried him left and right, and Brando would occasionally grab the head of a frost giant that was pouncing on him. A ball of flame burst out from Bahamut's blessing, and it would be blown away. Sometimes he would cut off the head of the frost giants with his sword, and then he would attack left and right, forcibly opening a bloody path. But even so, the number of wolves following him was getting smaller and smaller. The army of frost giants seemed to be endless. Brando looked up and saw enemies on all sides, and there was no way out. The last male wolf also fell behind him. The last chance had come. Brando was well aware of it. He patted the neck of the male wolf that he was sitting on, and the male wolf was already covered in bruises. "Give me one last ride, buddy," he whispered. The male wolf seemed to understand his whispers. It looked at him with its gray eyes, and its eyes were cold and wooden. But suddenly, it turned its head and let out a low growl. Brando felt the scenery around him disappear, and at the same time, his body became light. He knew that the male wolf had risen into the air. It was still 300 meters away from Ko Hua. Brando felt that the male wolf had carried him to the highest point. Below it, he looked up and saw the heads of the frost giants. The male wolf let out a whimper as if it was reminding him of something. Brando nodded, indicating that he understood. He raised the Haurangaya, and with almost all his strength, he swung it from bottom to top. A dazzling bright moon cut through the entire army of frost giants. For a moment, flesh and blood flew everywhere. Then the next moment, a row of long rock spikes rose from the ground one after another, forming a path nearly 100 meters long in the army of frost giants. Brando rose from the back of the male wolf. Milos's law suppressed his elemental power to the side because he could not fly. But this distance was enough. He landed steadily on the rock spikes and looked back. The male wolf was surrounded by the frost giants. Brando did not even have time to sigh. He turned around and galloped along the rock spikes towards the cliff where Ko Hua was. 200 meters to go. Ko Hua did not expect that even so, Brando would still be able to fight his way out. He was only elemental activated, but he was so tenacious. The other party was getting closer and closer to her. At this time she was no longer in the mood to be angry. She could not help but scream, "Milko's dragon, stop him!" There was a sharp howl in the air. Brando only felt his scalp tingle. He looked up and saw the clouds descending. 2 dragons, one in front and one behind, rushed towards him. As for where these dragons came from, there was no doubt that in Milos's kingdom, it was too easy for him to have anything appear here. However, Ko Hua had obviously lost her mind. The power in the kingdom was not unlimited. Just to deal with him, a mortal, she had paid too much and even lost more than she gained. But Brando was very clear about the hatred she had for him. Especially a woman in hatred, sometimes she was unreasonable. The air seemed to explode because of the vibration of the dragon wings. Brando finally knew how the halfling cavalry felt when facing a loss. The feeling of numbness and blankness was too uncomfortable. If he could see his eyes, he would find that his pupils were turning black. This was because the pressure on his mind was too great. A string was almost broken because it was too tight. Brando could not help but let out a roar, and at the last moment he activated the charge skill. Because of the sudden acceleration he missed the first dragon. Brando immediately breathed a sigh of relief. With the previous experience, the fear in his heart suddenly dissipated a lot. However, the second dragon had already swooped down and circled in his path. In an instant it was above his head. Brando knew that the dragon was a very intelligent creature. After seeing what happened to its companion, it might not be fooled a second time. Moreover, he did not have the cooldown of the charge skill. The dragon flapped its wings and began to lower its altitude. Brando saw that it was a red dragon. When it flapped its wings, it even pulled a long flame behind it. Where the flame swept, the rain was completely evaporated. It swept past with a sharp whistle, and the scorching breath almost hit him in the face. Brando had no choice but to activate the tree's toughness skill. But even so, the flame burned through his body and instantly turned him into ashes. Dark Ko Hua saw this scene and could not help but show an excited and relieved expression. But just as she was happy for a moment, her face immediately sank. because a moment later she saw Brando appear again, and he appeared behind the red dragon. It was an illusion and her dragon was fooled. Dark Ko-Hwa clenched her fist in anger. P.S. First release then release the next chapter around 20 points. Looking for votes. Chapter 837. The fire cloud swept over his head, and Brando had to slap it twice to extinguish the flames on his hair. But he couldn't care less, and his earl coat was suddenly wrapped in flames, like a cloak made of flames. The cold wind swept and the flames scattered with the wind. The young earl's upper body was suddenly exposed to the icy rain. The icy rain of the wilderness hit his body, and the coldness seemed to seep into his bones. Brando was so cold that he shivered. Originally, with his current physical fitness, he wouldn't feel uncomfortable even if he was bare-chested in the snow. But here he felt a chill coming from the depths of his bones along his spine. The chill came from the law. Damn it, this is the real asterisk 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 asterisk. He couldn't help but curse. Although he was lucky enough to use the 9 luminary sword art to deceive the dragon, but the dragon's breath was just too terrifying. When the dragon spread its wings and swept across a distance of more than 10 meters, the flame breath almost roasted him into a human torch. Only then did Brendel realize the horror of the dragon. Usually, the impression that Allah's gave him was too much of a human, and he almost forgot that these sky overlords that soared in the sky were one of the most terrifying existences in the world. Brando looked back. The 2 giant dragons, one in front and one behind, had already flown far away in the rain. For a while there was no sign of them turning back. And the distance between him and Ko-Hwa was in fact only a cliff away. Brando stopped at the last rock spike and looked up. The dark Ko-Hwa stood motionless at the top of the cliff. Her bright eyes seemed to pass through the rain, looking down at him from above. The frost giant's attack seemed to have stagnated for a moment with Ko-Hwa's actions. "You've seen Mother?" she asked quietly. Her voice was not loud, but it spread throughout the battlefield. The dark Ko-Hwa seemed to have calmed down, if one didn't look at her tightly pursed lips and cold eyes, but Brando knew that she was just suppressing the raging anger in her heart. He nodded. "How can you manipulate the wolves? Why don't you guess?" Brando smiled and raised his head to answer. The dark Ko-Hwa looked at him as if he was looking at something that didn't know the difference between life and death. "There's no need. In any case you'll be buried here today." "You'll be buried with me," the girl replied coldly. "I'm afraid not. I don't plan to die here." Brando shook his head and smiled confidently. "Not only that, I still want to save you." "Save me?" Ko-Hwa in the darkness was slightly startled. Her face revealed an angry smile. "What a joke, a bunch of nonsense." She raised her hand and a bolt of lightning zigzagged through the clouds, illuminating the world in a vast expanse of white. The rumbling of thunder rolled over, accompanied by her cold voice giving an order. "Daughters of the sea, attack your enemies." Brando saw that behind the cliff where Ko-Hwa was standing, there were raging waves. Just a moment ago there was still a field hanging low in the sky, but suddenly the waves surged. One after another, long heads stretched out from under the sea. They came from the deep sea and they had a common name: Hydra's children. Countless 9-headed snakes, 12-headed snakes and 15-headed lizards suddenly appeared in front of Brando. They came from the sea, their tall bodies like mountains. One after another there were more than 100 of them. And behind all the mountain-like figures, behind the clouds, a huge shadow that seemed to connect the sky and the earth stood at the intersection of the sea and the sky. Brando only needed to look at the huge figure to know what it was. The ancestor beast. But this time it was no longer Ekis Nightmare, but the king of the 9-headed snakes that truly existed in this kingdom. As the king of the world in this domain, Ko-Hwa could conjure up any existence she wanted out of thin air. The moment he saw the huge shadow in the clouds, Brando truly understood the difference between the so-called ultimate domain and the god's kingdom. This was a world with a system of its own. But Ko-Hwa is really crazy. Brando shook his head. She had gone completely crazy in order to kill him. Although the scene in front of him looked magnificent, it was not necessary to deal with him. The dark Ko-Hwa was just endlessly consuming her power. She knew this, but she still insisted on doing so. To put it mildly, she was stubborn, but in fact she was just angry. The temperament of Ekis' eldest daughter was, after all, not a true god. Of course, she could just be testing the bottom line of a true god's kingdom. But Brando felt that this possibility was very small. From their previous contact, it could be seen that she did not seem to be a very scheming existence. In comparison, the kind Ko-Hwa was much wiser and more patient than her. In fact, he had a faint illusion in his heart that perhaps Ko Hua was the eldest daughter of Ekis, who was really dominant, and the dark Ko Hua was just her other side. But he really could not imagine how a little girl with such a gentle temperament could be the leader of the Twilight Wolves in the ancient war. Not to mention killing, the kind Ko Hua was not even willing to be involved in any battle. From any point of view, she was a true pacifist. Brando immediately shook his head and threw these messy thoughts out of his mind, because in front of him, the 9-headed snakes were slowly coming ashore and surrounding him. He raised his head again and asked with a smile, "Miss Ko Hua, I have a question." Ko Hua frowned deeply. She did not understand what kind of mentality this guy had when he was about to make a final struggle and instead asked a question. "Do you have a backup plan or have you already given up struggling?" She silently muttered to herself, but could not think of a reason. But since Brando was waiting for death, she was happy to see it, so she calmly said, "Question? What kind of resentment does your family have against the ancestral divine beast?" Dark Ko Hua was stunned. "What do you mean?" She was slightly stunned and did not react for a moment, but then she saw the faint smile on Brando's face and understood that he was just teasing her. At that moment, the anger in Dark Ko Hua's heart rose. This damn bastard, he's still so stubborn even when death is at hand. She gritted her teeth and was about to give the order to attack, but at this time, she saw Brando suddenly jump into the Frost Giant's encirclement. Giving up? Other than that, Dark Ko Hua could not think of any other reason for Brando's actions. However, she was really confused by this strange human's abnormal behavior again and again. She really didn't understand what he meant by provoking her one moment and suddenly giving up on resisting the next. Was it just to annoy her? Wasn't this too much of a joke? "Don't let him die, catch him." She was angry in her heart and fiercely gave the order, "You want to die so easily? It's not that easy." But as soon as the words came out, then something strange happened. Dark Ko Hua suddenly found that after Brando jumped, his whole person seemed to have disappeared into thin air, and his aura was completely gone. She froze and almost suspected that she had sensed wrongly. She quickly probed along Milos's law domain again. It was reasonable to say that in her own domain, there could not be any fish that had escaped the net. After she carefully sensed again, there was still only the aura of Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, Veronica, the Shire, Peya, and Yeruta. Her eyebrows suddenly raised slightly, and she felt that there was another person hiding under the platform. She suddenly remembered that person. It should be the human priest from before, and she had escaped. But Dark Ko Hua immediately shifted her attention away. She was too lazy to care about these insects. She was only concerned about one question now. Where did Brando go? Her spirit swept across the entire hall like a network, but other than those mentioned above, there was no other human in her entire domain. How is this possible? Dark Ko Hua's heart was extremely strange. In this situation, it could only be that Brando had suddenly teleported away through some kind of spell, or transferred to other realms. But these were obviously impossible because not to mention how difficult it was to cast a spell in her domain without her noticing, the entire space was completely shrouded under the dimensional anchor, and any spatial spells and realm spells were completely blocked. How could it be possible to cast a spell in this situation? Her heart was in a panic, and it was pure panic about the unknown. A living person had disappeared in her domain, and she had not noticed at all. What kind of demigod was this? But it was at this moment that Ko Hua suddenly heard a gentle voice coming from behind her. "Are you looking for me?" Dark Ko Hua was like a frightened little girl, and she turned around in fright. She looked at Brando with a dumbfounded expression and pointed at him. You. But she did not say anything. After Brando disappeared, she thought of countless possibilities, but the moment she saw him again, she understood that the truth was so simple. At this moment, Brando who appeared in front of her did not have the slightest trace of a human's aura. There was only a strong aura of a magical creature, exactly the same as the 9-headed dragon she summoned. How did you do it?" Ko Hua almost lost her voice. There were many spells that could disguise oneself as a magical creature. But any disguise would not work in her domain, because the fluctuations of the spell itself would expose the effect of the spell, and the same was true for magical items. But the Brendel who appeared in front of her did not emit any magic waves, nor was there any sign of magic items taking effect. It was as if the person in front of her was a genuine magic beast, a genuine one, honest to all. Brando also smiled slightly but did not answer. In fact, the reason was very simple. He was now a magical creature because his magical aura came from his elite skill. This skill itself was a magical creature skill, and she had never heard of a player with the title of elite. Elite Skill Demonization Level 1. Basic, Elite/Normal. For a short period of time, the aura of the body was disguised as a magical creature's aura, so that magical creatures below the Lord level would not take the initiative to attack. This effect lasted for 1 minute or until the user took the initiative to attack. Unfortunately, if Ko Hua did not erase his own law, if she was still the eldest daughter of the Alpha Wolf Ekis, and not the current identity of a god, then as the lord of the magical creatures she would have easily discovered him. But the problem was that there were no ifs in history. Brando almost wanted to snicker. All the coincidences had led to the result of him appearing in front of her so easily. He raised Haurangaya and assumed the posture before he attacked. The cold rain poured down his naked upper body, outlining the strong curves of his muscles. Oh! Ko Hua finally reacted. Thunder and lightning gathered in her hand like a long whip. She swung it forward fiercely, as if she wanted to integrate endless anger into this attack to completely kill Brando. But the bright halo around Brando's body had already flashed, and the thunder whip first pierced through the fire shield summoned by the blessing of Bahamut, then tore a hole in the collision halo, and then pierced through the layer of tree armor formed by the tough tree on Brando's skin. Brando groaned. Even with his defense and willpower, this attack still made him feel as if it came from the depths of his soul. His life instantly reached the bottom, and the unyielding talent directly took over his soul. But he continued to move forward, the long sword in his hand shining like a blazing torch. The collision halo, the tough tree, and the brilliance of all kinds of protective equipment completely disappeared in an instant, as if their power had been sucked out, and all the energy flow gathered together and gathered into the Haurangaya in Brando's hand. Crown of Thorns. Extracting all the defensive abilities and transferring them to attack, the ultimate skill of the Templar Knight finally shone brightly here. The Haurangaya hit the threads of law around Ko Hua, the huge force almost distorting the threads of law. Ko Hua was the first to scream, but this did not come from Brando's attack, but from the backlash of the blood of Sunday originally. The dark Ko Hua in the state of false god was strong in attack but weak in defense, and now the consequences of her all-out attack finally showed. The sharp pain penetrated deep into her soul, and the heavy injury caused her to almost tremble. Even the threads of law around her were shaking. And it was at this moment Brando's piercing strike, which he had been holding back all this time, exploded, and the air let out an ear-piercing sound. The dark blue threads of law around dark Ko Hua were quickly bent back at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then were completely torn apart. The stable threads of law finally collapsed at this moment. Ko Hua still wanted to salvage the situation, but Brando's figure suddenly disappeared in front of her, and in the next moment she only saw a pair of large hands grabbing towards her. No. This is the spatial element. This was the only chaotic thought in the dark Ko Hua's mind. He clearly said that his power of order was only enough for him to use once. He lied to me again. Her vision turned black and she almost fainted from anger. She would never have dreamed that Brando would still weave a trap for her when he clearly had the upper hand, because in her eyes, it was not necessary at all. Although now it seemed like it was very necessary. Brando threw away Haurangaya. He had no intention of killing Ko Hua. In fact, he also understood that he could not kill this damned woman. The boss could not possibly only have so little HP, but the threads of law would only collapse for a moment. He had to seize this opportunity. He pressed down on dark Ko Hua's shoulders and pushed her to the ground. Dark Ko Hua did not expect this kind of attack at all, and in her shock she was heavily hit on the ground, almost seeing stars. She was frightened. She felt the naked upper body of the human man on top of her, holding her down tightly. What is he doing? She was shocked and angry, and for a moment she even forgot to resist and just stared blankly at Brando. She probably never dreamed that the opponent would make such a move. But when she opened her eyes wide in shock and anger, she saw Brando withdraw one of his hands, and with a backhand he stabbed his own forehead. Blood flowed down his arm, mixed with the rain, and dripped onto her cheeks. Although the blood instantly vaporized when it came close to her body made of lightning, she was still scared stiff. What is this disgusting human doing? She suddenly noticed that Brando had taken the black crystal from her forehead. Dark Ko Hua instantly froze in place as if she had been enchanted, and for a moment she only felt her hands and feet turn cold. No! She screamed, "You can't do this, let me go." Brando's face was covered in blood, but he smiled at Ekis' eldest daughter, a smile that made her feel cold to the bones. Then Brando picked up the black crystal that was covered in blood, and gently placed it on her forehead. "Miss Ko Hua, you are Ekis' eldest daughter, the leader of the Wolf clan. You are their natural leader. You can erase your own laws, but you can't erase these memories and feelings. So it's better to come back. No. Corfu was on the verge of tears. With a loud hum, the moment Brando's hand touched Ko Hua's forehead, a terrifying shockwave exploded with the two of them as the center. This shockwave instantly engulfed the entire battlefield, and those frost giants, those hydras, the great plains, the turbulent sea, the low dark clouds, and the huge figure on the horizon all disappeared in an instant. And Brando was also lifted up by this shockwave and thrown far away. He raised his head, narrowed his eyes, and could even see Ko Hua being thrown in the other direction, struggling in the air like a kite. But it was enough. He breathed a sigh of relief. This shockwave came from the rejection of other laws by Milos's laws. Since it occurred, it meant that the dark Ko Hua could no longer integrate into this kingdom. His guess was right, Ko Hua really did kill herself and completely erase her own laws. But unfortunately, she probably never dreamed that Brando would have this thing in his hands. Ekis's heart of disaster. Just as Brando said, she was still the leader of the Wolf clan after all. When the laws of Ekis's heart of Alpha merged into her body, all her previous efforts were turned to ashes in an instant. From this moment on, Surash, who only existed for a moment, disappeared, and the dark Ko Hua returned to this world. The only change was that she, like him, lost her power in Milos's domain. And next, it would be a fair battle? P.S. Begging for votes. Chapter 838. All the illusions disappeared. The battlefield returned to the platform in the abyss, but the surroundings seemed to have quieted down. Bit by bit, time stopped. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles was still flying towards the bottom of the platform, holding his great sword. The Shire's magic sparks suddenly blossomed and froze at that moment. The falling ice on the surrounding cliffs seemed to have stopped forever, and in the ice cave the four black knights were still holding their bows. Only on the platform, Brando and Dark Ko Hua each occupied half of the space, one still and one moving as if they were two completely opposite images. Brando was slowly standing up from the ground, his upper body naked. Blood slowly slid down his forehead, along his neck, across his shoulder, upper arm, forearm, and wrist as if drawing out a scarlet tattoo. The rose-colored blood droplets slowly dripped down the dark body of the Haurangaya, falling to the ground, rippling a thin layer of dust. Brando calmly looked at Dark Ko Hua, who was kneeling on the ground in front of him. She was giggling loudly. As if she had gone crazy, she laughed until her whole body trembled, and then coughed violently, her whole body curled up into a ball. The girl's forehead and face were stained with blood, but it wasn't hers but Brendel's. The bright and blazing lightning had receded from her body, and the color of her eyes had returned to their usual gentle redness. Her long black hair was like sandalwood, and her skin was pale white, as if she had just come out of a bath of milk. Her long black robe was like an orchid, quietly blooming on the platform. Ha! Cough cough cough. Ha! Dark Ko Hua coughed and laughed happily, her shoulders shaking violently, and then she raised her head again, looking at Brando with a resentful and gloating gaze, somewhat like a wolf, her eyes dark. Ah! Cough cough. You should have felt it, right? Brando did not say a word. In his vision, the borders around the platform were gradually turning light silver, and these silver areas were gradually expanding, slowly approaching with Ko Hua as the center. They were expanding faster and faster, piece by piece as if they had a life of their own, extending towards Dark Ko Hua in the center. He stood there quietly and could also feel an ancient, as if a new breath was growing, slowly merging into this world. Milo's divine power law. Ah! You're too smart, human. Dark Ko Hua's eyes were filled with joy. She took a breath, then shook her head indifferently, kneeling on the ground like a weak girl. She even looked at Brando a little weakly and said, "You almost succeeded, but you've become a god." Brendel replied faintly. The laws of this world were recalculating. The entire outside of the land of God's eternal rest fell into a standstill. And in the endless void, a flame was reigniting, as if with the birth of this light, lines of laws from ancient times began to light up again. There was a voice calling the name of the slumbering dark abyss. Milos, the father of the frost giant. Just a thin line, Dark Ko Hua finally became a god. Crystal clear tears still hung on her cheeks, but she showed a bright smile. What, do you think you still have a chance? As she said, she tilted her head, looking at Brando with a curious gaze. But in that curiosity there was a deep hatred. Dark Ko Hua was smiling, her white fangs were faintly discernible. Brando looked at the silver area that was gradually nibbling away. 5 more minutes, he replied quietly. I still have 5 more minutes to kill you. The girl giggled, laughing so hard that she couldn't help but cough again. Cough, cough, cough. That's true, if only you were immortal. She coughed violently, looking at Brando with tears in her eyes as if she had heard the biggest joke in the world. Her blood-red eyes were full of regret. Unfortunately, the gods and the crystal made an agreement, leaving the right to choose the future in the hands of mortals. Brando, Dark Ko-Hua smiled very sweetly, almost to the point of being charming. As the successor of the Dark Dragon, as a divine citizen, you can't kill me. Only mortals can kill me. And thanks to you, only divine citizens can move freely in this domain. Do you understand now? There is no one here who can stop me. She slowly stood up and replied softly, millions of years later humans will once again choose their fate. And this time no one can change it. Brando didn't say a word. But there was a voice that answered the question for him. Brando can't change it, the voice replied clearly and firmly. I will change it. Brando's and Ko-Hua's faces changed at the same time. But one was surprised and the other was shocked. Who is it? Ko-Hua's smile disappeared and she screamed nervously. Suddenly, on the other side of the two, a faint blue light seemed to form a door, and a girl wearing a knight's uniform with the Lionheart sword at her waist slowly stepped onto the platform. She looked up at Dark Ko-Hua and answered seriously, I don't understand where Brando came from and I don't understand why he can't stop you, but at least I know, goddess, I can still make a choice. Because she pressed her hand to her chest and answered word by word, came from Buchi and I am the mortal you speak of. At that moment, Dark Ko-Hua's expression was extremely interesting, as if all her expressions were frozen at that moment. No, this isn't true, she said, shaking her head. No, you must consider your choice carefully, it concerns the future of this world. Listen carefully, little girl, it was Lady Martha who gave you everything, you must not be ungrateful. She saw Freya slowly unsheathing her sword, the light of the sword almost blinded her eyes, and her face suddenly became pale. No, I can make you a demigod, you can be with him forever, and together we will return this world to the glory of the ancient era. She talked endlessly, but the night girl didn't seem to hear her. She slowly unsheathed the Lionheart sword, then turned to look at Brando. Brando smiled at her. Freya. Brando. He raised Haurangaya, let me see what you learned at the Royal Knight Academy. In Milo's domain, everyone's power was completely rejected, even Ko-Hua herself. They still had 5 minutes before the Silver Domain completely merged with Dark Ko-Hua. In these 5 minutes, this battle would only be decided by experience and skill. Both of them were calm, and Ko-Hua seemed to have lost the ability to speak. Her face was a bit stiff, because she had already seen the light blue figure behind Freya. Why Milos? This is my agreement with Crystal, Ko-Hua, we should give them more choices. A voice seemed to answer from somewhere. You're being biased. She gritted her teeth. Ko-Hua, you and I belong to different camps, we each believe in different truths, but I only have one request for you, at least let the choice of history be fair, the voice replied. If you believe that chaos is the only truth in this universe, then you won't be afraid that it will fail, right? The voice paused and answered with some pride, I'm the same. Dark Ko-Hua snorted softly but could only keep her mouth shut. She looked up at the man and woman in front of her. Both of them were already in the posture before attacking. The Haurangaya's blade trembled slightly, Brando closed his eyes, and in front of him was like a summer night, in the darkness, the bright river of stars in the sky. He began to move forward, feeling the steps, and with him, Freya also began to move forward. The two moved together, their steps almost exactly the same. The black blade, the silver blade, swayed gently. Do you still remember the battle in Buchi? Brando asked without turning his head. The battle in the Golden Orchard. Freya paused for a moment, then immediately nodded. This time, Brando answered, I'll continue to cover for you. He leveled the Haurangaya. Freya. The charge skill was activated again. Brando stabbed towards Ko-Hua with a flash of light. This strike had nothing to do with laws, nothing to do with elements, even the power was suppressed to the lowest level by Milo's domain. This was a simple life and death battle. Dark Ko-Hua's eyes burned with anger, she stepped back and reached out to block Brando's blade, her reaction not at all delayed. Purely in terms of combat experience, she was not inferior to Brando. But unfortunately, Brando was not fighting alone. Attack in turn. Brando roared. A light blue figure appeared behind Brando. Erwin's knight uniform was so conspicuous in the eyes of the eldest daughter of Ekis. The silver Lionheart sword pierced towards the goddess like a lion's fangs. Maynard once hoped that this sword could change the fate of a kingdom, and today it was indeed changing the fate of some people. It was just that these people were all over the continent of Vaunt. Dim Corfa roared in anger. Freya's swordsmanship was so crude that it was almost unbearable to look at. Unable to bear it any longer, she clawed at the female knight, but in the next moment, a pitch-black blade blocked her path. That damn guy. She raised her head and saw Brando's half-smile. She had no choice but to grab Brando's blade, throw it away and step back to avoid Freya's sword. But how could Brando let her do as she wished? He threw away Haurangaya and grabbed her wrist. This bastard. Ko Hua was furious, and without thinking she used her left hand to stab Brando's abdomen. As soon as she made her move, she realized something was wrong. She suddenly remembered that the guy in front of her was a fugitive. Dim Corfa raised her head, and as expected, she saw Brendel giving her a weird smile. It's over. Ekis' eldest daughter felt her mind go blank at that moment. With a soft sound, she felt her hand enter Brando's abdomen without any resistance. Brando's face twitched, but he didn't seem to feel any pain. He grabbed her wrist and pulled hard, pulling her over. Then Brando hugged her and forced her to turn around to face Freya. No! Ko Hua screamed. At that moment, Freya and Dark Ko Hua widened their eyes at the same time. But Dark Ko Hua stared blankly at the Lionheart sword in her heart. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Only blood gushed out from the corner of her mouth. The girl frowned in pain and gasped for breath. She looked at all of this with great reluctance. She looked at the platform that should have brought her glory, looked at the barrel-shaped abyss, looked at Freya, and finally turned her head with difficulty. She looked at Brando with hatred. Ko Hua, this is the answer, despicable. She answered weakly to the voice in the dark. Freya almost trembled as she watched the goddess in front of her close her eyes. She gently let go of the sword in her hand and opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something. But thousands of words turned into one worrisome sentence. Brando, I'm fine. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Dark Ko Hua's body was becoming lighter in his hand, as if it was beginning to become nothing. And the time and space around them seemed to gradually return to normal. He looked back and saw the silver area at the edge of the platform dissipating. Milos's law was retreating into the dark void. This was a good sign. He let out a long breath and answered weakly, "Thank goodness you avoided the heart." As he said this, he couldn't help but cough. A wave of weakness and fear surged in his heart. It was as if the moment the battle ended, he began to feel weak all over and couldn't help but sway and fall. But someone hugged him. Freya hugged him tightly. The normal order of time seemed to be restored the moment Dark Ko Hua died. Haru's eyes widened as he saw the Black Knight in black cloaks raise their bows and walk to the edge of the ice cave. And the Black Knight's movements were so natural as if for them, they didn't notice that there was such a long pause in the middle, or even the change on the platform. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, as if by inertia, they raised the longbows in their hands according to the original plan. At this time, the ice that had been frozen in midair a moment ago fell off the cliff with a crash. The Black Knight aimed at Brando and Freya on the platform. Time was so short that they didn't realize where Freya came from, nor did they consider this question. They instinctively recognized that Freya and the Count Tanajil were allies. Then they drew their bows. Aruz took 2 rapid breaths. He opened his mouth, but Shido beside him seemed to have noticed his actions first. The scholar girl's eyes widened and she shook her head desperately, motioning him not to be impulsive. But the little prince only cared about his teacher's safety. He was innocent by nature, and he didn't care about his own situation. The knight loosened his fingers and there was a soft sound. The long arrow left the bowstring. "Teacher, be careful. It's the Black Knight, they're coming." The little prince also shouted at the top of his lungs. The leader of the Black Knight reacted immediately, drew his sword and rushed over. He raised his sword and instinctively wanted to put it on the little prince's neck. But it was at this time that he suddenly found that he couldn't move. In fact, all the Black Knight in the cave froze at the same time. The golden threads of law spread in the ice cave and had wrapped around everyone. And the Black Knight who had just released an arrow at the entrance of the cave also found that their arrows were all blocked by a behemoth. It was a dragon. A gigantic dragon with a pair of wings spread out, its scales shining with a dazzling golden light. Its golden pupils seemed to be surrounded by blazing flames. It raised its head and raised its 2 pairs of horns high, looking down at them from a high vantage point. This creature that seemed to come from the ancient times had just raised its wings at the other end of the canyon a moment ago, but in the blink of an eye, she had already appeared in front of them. "Lady Alas." Shido's excited and incredulous voice finally rang out. "Haha, we're saved now." This was Philas's cry. and beside him, Lorena also breathed a sigh of relief. In fact, among all of them, even the crew's crown prince, who had always been sullen, couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. But when he looked back, he saw that the little prince had already fainted after giving that warning. "If I were you," Alaz warned, but full of her unique playfulness, she narrowed her eyes dangerously and said to the leader of the Black Knight holding the sword, "I would obediently put down the sword." The knight obviously didn't expect a dragon to appear in front of him at all. He was slightly startled for a moment, but then sighed, raised the sword in his hand, loosened his grip, and then dropped the sword with a clang. In the ice cave, the Black Knight looked at each other, but after a moment of hesitation, the clanging sound of swords being thrown rang out. Brando looked up at the shadow of the dragon passing by in midair. He rested his head on the girl's thigh, only feeling tired and weak as if his whole body had been emptied, but he pursed his lips and smiled knowingly in his heart. P.S. This volume of Trajectory of Change has almost come to an end here. There are probably 1 or 2 chapters left. Starting from the next volume, Brando will really step onto a bigger stage, going to cruise, fighting against Madara, and truly changing Erwin's fate. Thank you all for your continued support. Also, please count votes for Blackie's Descent of Disaster. His new book is in the first month. Please support everyone. Chapter 839. You're sure. Old Bayard called out from the house next door. The 13 or 14-year-old girl who was lying on the wooden table answered and looked away from the flickering candle. Not far away, the sky outside the window had been gloomy for the past few days. Dark clouds covered the horizon, and purple lightning flashed one after another. She looked up at the terrible weather and sighed. She walked out of the door and asked, "What's the matter? Father, what's wrong? Go get my cloak and bring the carriage out. This weather can't do any work. I'll send the farm tools to the city for Birdos to fix." Old Bayard was putting on his shoes on his bench as he replied. Yorashir stood by the door of her room and looked at the terrible weather outside the living room. She frowned and looked a little worried. She rolled up her sleeves and crossed her white arms in front of her apron. "Are we going out in this weather?" she said reluctantly. Old Bayard could hear the concern in his daughter's voice. He glanced at the weather outside and said with a smile, "It's just a gentle breeze and a gentle rain. After a while the weather will get worse. At that time it won't be easy to go out." Yorashir sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked across the living room and took a cloak from the shelf and put it on Old Bayard. "Go and comfort Ansi and Arlo. They're still young. The lightning must have scared them." Old Bayard squinted his eyes and let his daughter put her arms around his neck to help him put on the cloak. He enjoyed this silent warmth as he spoke. "The road is slippery. The carriage won't be able to travel well," Yorashir said softly. "It's all right, my good child. Those bad things won't come out in this weather." Old Bayard laughed. Yorashir knew that her father was saying this to reassure her. Ever since the little lord began to restore order in the early summer, there were very few traces of goblins and bandits in the countryside. She pursed her lips and didn't say a word. "All right, go." Old Bayard gently looked at his daughter's face that was becoming more and more similar to his late wife's. Yorashir nodded and turned to leave. She walked through the yard in the rain. The stable was at the back of the farm. She pushed open the wooden door. It was very dark inside the small shed. The 2 fillies were indeed restless in this weather. Stepping on the hay on the ground, Jocelyn walked to the side of the mare named Ansi. She patted its neck gently and tried to calm it down. But today was a little different than usual. The gray-furred mare kept stomping her feet. Her big moist eyes were especially bright in the dark, and there was a strong light of anxiety in them. "What happened?" Xiaoshir frowned. She could feel that Ansi's fear did not come from the bright lightning in the sky, but from the ground. She squatted down slightly and stared at the pile of hay on the ground with her bright eyes. In her sight, the hay was trembling slightly. In just a moment the girl understood. The ground was moving. A very bad feeling rose in Yorashir's heart. She immediately stood up and rushed to the wooden fence that locked the horses. Gritting her teeth, she pulled the iron chain out of the lock and threw it to the ground. She then opened the wooden fence and let the 2 horses out. She then rushed them out of the stable. It was only a moment of delay, but the ground was already shaking. The puddles outside were already rippling. Just as Xiaoshir ran out of the hut, she heard a strange buzzing sound coming from the north. She stopped in her tracks and subconsciously turned her head back. The Ansara forest came into view from the north. At the top of the forest, a huge ball of light seemed to rise. The ball of light pierced through the clouds, and because it was too bright and blinding, it seemed to make the world around it slightly dim. Then, a deafening explosion that seemed to tear the air apart swept across like a shock wave, causing a few strands of hair to fly up. The buzzing sound in the ears turned into a loud rumble, and gradually merged into a high-pitched ear-piercing shriek, like the waves of the sea. But gradually the sound became a buzzing noise in the ears, and then formed a higher wave that drowned everything. The canopy was still flipping, the branches and leaves were flying all over the sky, lightning flashed, thunder roared, wind and rain intertwined, but the surroundings were like a silent world. In this silent world, Yorishir watched in horror as the ball of light grew bigger and bigger. Bit by bit, it engulfed the sky and the clouds. Its spherical surface began to collapse as it expanded. The incandescent white shell shattered in an instant, and a blinding flame burst out from within. The flame continued to spread in all directions like a cloud. At first it was very slow, as if it was far away. But suddenly she saw the cloud of fire appear above Ansera and engulf the entire forest in an instant. The towering wall of fire continued to move forward. The sharp cedars, the tall black pines, and the rolling hills had already turned into a sea of fire. The scorching heat hit her in the face. Yorishir's hair danced wildly in the air. In the blink of an eye, the stable had been destroyed in front of her. Yorishir screamed and turned to run. But it was too late. With a loud bang, the flames swept across the entire farm like a hurricane, turning everything into ashes. Ah! Yorishir opened her eyes with a pale face. Her body was already soaked in cold sweat. She propped herself up from the wooden table and realized that she had the same nightmare again. It had been more than a month since the terrible explosion. Although she later found out that the explosion happened in the deadly tundra forest in the north, and the area affected was only north of the Golden Sparrow Mountains and east of the Falling Needle Hills. But in her dream, she dreamed more than once of the flames engulfing the Ansera forest and the farm. The whole of Anthony was a sea of hellfire. She raised her head and looked out the window at the road that led to Kirkus. The forest beside the road was lush and quiet. The sky above the canopy was as blue as the sea. Strands of cotton formed a white trail. Ever since the explosion, the weather had been getting better day by day. From time to time, there were riders on the road in 2s and 3s. Some of them were carrying the banner of nobility. Most of them were knights from the nearby area. Some were simply adventurers. These people had been appearing one after another since half a month ago. Although adventurers usually gathered around this time of year, it was rare to see such a scene in a small place like Bernissel. Moreover, they were all heading north. Yorishir! Someone shouted. Yorishir looked at the person who greeted her. It was the hunter who lived next door. He seemed to have gone to the city some time ago. Uncle Betcher, you came back from the city? Did you see my father? She quickly asked. Old Bayard. I saw him at the blacksmith's. What's wrong? The hunter replied. Nothing, just worried. Uncle Betcher, do you know what's going on? She glanced at the passing knight and asked softly. You mean those knight lords? The hunter stood by the fence and looked at the noble knight on the road. He shook his head and said, They're looking for someone. Looking for someone? Yes, looking for someone. Fort Valendon. It had been 5 weeks since the explosion, and Eek, Yura, Makarov and Count Odin could tell that the princess was getting more and more anxious even though she looked calm on the surface. Fortunately, the negotiations with the Duke were smooth. On the surface, Duke Viro was Count Randner's mortal enemy. The two of them had fought on and off the stage countless times. Now that there was a chance to eliminate his enemy, he naturally would not let it go. But in fact, even a brat like Eek could see that Duke Viro was doing this for the sake of the late king. The Duke's daughter was actually the princess mother. When they saw Griffin calling the Duke grandfather, even the most senior members of the royal faction such as Makarov and Oberway were stunned. It was as if they just remembered that the Duke had married an elf as his wife when he was young. However, no one had ever seen the face of the Duchess, nor did they know that there was a silver elf Duchess in the kingdom of Erewhon. However, Makarov and the others slowly realized that the little girl who once obeyed them wasn't as obedient as they thought. In fact, the princess had such a trump card from the very beginning. King Oberg VII's marriage was arranged by the royal family. Although the fact that the king was marrying a half-elf would inevitably lead to rumors, the old king still displayed his stubbornness in this matter as usual. Moreover, the queen of the kingdom was at least a human, and the royal faction did not want to provoke Oberg VII over such a small matter. But they did not expect that today Makarov and the others finally understood that the stubborn old king did not pursue some illusory love. The Highland Knights side did not know what they were thinking, but they were so enthusiastic that it was incomprehensible. Originally, they wanted to say that the upcoming war had nothing to do with them, but not only did they send an official group of magi from the Black Tower, they also promised that as long as the princess declared war against Count Randner, they would join the princess side. This kind of attitude was no longer like an alliance, but more like a pledge of allegiance. This way the royal faction could not understand. The Highland Knights' political system had always been aloof from the political system of Erewhon. Even when the royal power was at its peak, these knights and magi only maintained a respectful relationship with the royal family. Since when did they show such a humble attitude? After all, at this point in time, they were technically the stronger party. After Her Highness had settled the situation in Ampere Seal, she had only relied on her own small territory and the help of that illegitimate Count Trentheim to barely make it to this point. In fact, if Duke Vero was not willing to side with them, the eldest son of the Northern King would have a better chance. But the situation continued to develop in such a confusing way. Because of the precedent of the Highland Knight, even the Duke of Grenoire's envoy came to express his loyalty. This was because everyone knew that the Duke did not have much ambition. Instead of calling him a noble, it was better to call him a hermit who did not care about the outside world. In fact, before the Duke of Grenoire's envoy came, there were people who maliciously speculated that the Duke could not be so well informed, and these envoys were most likely arranged by his aides and retainers. Later on, this guess was proven to be correct. Of course, regarding these details, everyone had a tacit understanding, and it was fine as long as they maintained a tacit understanding. But these details at least made people understand one thing. Erewhon's royal power was about to rise. The smooth diplomatic process could not hide the uneasiness of Princess Grenoire's. Bugha and Oberway had already returned to Lanteneilen. After all, the explosion happened at the junction of Lanteneilen and Vero. Everyone wanted to know what happened in the big explosion a month ago. And the news from the front was mostly unsettling. In the report of the scouts, it seemed that the entire deadly frost forest had completely disappeared. In the east of the Gun Mountains, in the area south of Violet Castle, there was a brand new area of death magic. The remaining energy proved that there had been a shocking explosion there before. And there was a lot of evidence pointing to a huge crater in the center of the explosion. But so far, no survivors were found in the explosion. In the higher circles, especially the princess and the people around her, they knew better what this meant. The little prince had not returned yet. Count Tonajul was also nowhere to be seen. But what made Makarov and Count Audine even more uneasy was that they knew that the first successor of the Cruz family was also missing in the explosion. Their large noble observation group and the commander of the Azure Skies were also missing. In fact, Makarov and Count Audine had already received news from their own channels. The Cruz family's diplomatic group had already left the Empire and was on their way to Erewhon. This was definitely not a good sign. But not until earlier in the day. An unexpected guest visited Fort Valendon. Without a doubt, this was a guest that Princess Grenoire's had been waiting for a long time. Outside the window, the vines hanging down from the walls swayed in the shade. In the distance, the silent wind forest and the Gun Mountains were immersed in the blue background. The warm afternoon sun slowly climbed up the window and shone into the room through the veins of the leaves. Inside the room, behind an expensive black wooden desk, Princess Grenoire's was sitting quietly on the red velvet cushion on the long back chair. She tried to calm herself down, but couldn't help but ask about the time several times. "She's almost there. She's already passed the corridor, Your Highness." The maid smiled awkwardly. Princess Grenoire's nodded and took a deep breath. At this time there was finally a knock on the door. It was as if the whole room was silent for a moment before she replied softly, "Come in." The door was pushed open and Freya was behind the door. She was still wearing Erewhon's uniform, but her aura was much calmer than before. Other than her slightly flushed face, she was almost another Maynard. She was startled when she saw Princess Grenoire's. She thought it would be Makarov or Count Audine who would receive her, but she immediately gave a knight's salute. "Your Highness." "You don't have to be so polite." Grenoire's looked calm on the surface, but she took a few deep breaths to force herself to calm down. Count, is he all right?" "Your Highness Brando, he's fine." Freya whispered uneasily. However, Princess Grenoire's didn't seem to notice this. She moved uneasily, and although her subtle expression was almost undetectable, she still asked anxiously, "Then what about my brother?" "His Highness Haruz is also fine. He and Count Audine are both fine." Grenoire's let out a sigh of relief. Although she tried her best to suppress her weak expression, her mind was a little messy. She sat there for a while, feeling both happy and a little disappointed, especially for Count Tanagel's senses. After a while, she returned to her cold demeanor. Why didn't Count Audine come here himself? Miss Maynard and everyone are injured. His lordship wants to send them back to Frada or Abies first. Grimoires lowered her eyelids as if she was thinking. After a while, she looked at Freya again. Her silver eyes were clear. Freya, this is an excuse, right? Freya's face turned red. This was indeed an excuse. The real reason was that Scarlet was missing. Brando was trying his best to find clues about the Highlander girl. But that was not all. There were more profound reasons. But there were outsiders here. She remembered what Brando told her. She glanced at the maid next to the princess and nodded. Grimoires turned her head slightly and said to her maid, "Go and tell the Highland Knights gentlemen that Count Audine can't come, but he's still alive. Ask them what they think." The maid nodded slightly and left immediately. Grimoires then turned around and said, "What happened?" "And that explosion, I want to know what happened." Freya took a deep breath. "It's like this, Your Highness, Port Deltal." At dusk, a large carriage that seemed to be loaded with goods slowly moved along the crowd towards the port. But the crowd in front of the carriage was getting bigger and bigger. Something seemed to have happened on the road to the port. Not long after, the crowd was so dense that the carriage couldn't move forward. The carriage had to stop. The coachman turned around and asked something. Then, a man covered in a cloak jumped down from the carriage. The man seemed to have been injured recently, so he couldn't move easily. He limped to the front of the carriage and looked at the situation outside. Then he talked to the coachman for a while before he returned to the carriage. At this time, a voice came from inside the carriage. "What's wrong, boy mare?" The voice was a little dry and hoarse. It sounded like an old man. "It's good news, Babarn. We're saved." The former looked happy. He came to the side of the carriage and whispered, "It's our diplomatic party. They've just docked." There was a silence inside the carriage. Viscount Babarn was sitting on a pile of hay. His face was pale as if he had a terminal illness. When he heard his companion's words, he could not help but let out a long sigh of relief. Then he struggled to get up and used his hand to lift the corner of the carriage that was covered by a black cloth. It was a whole piece of crystal. Within the crystal, there was a red-haired girl holding a spear. Her angry expression was still vivid and lifelike. She was so beautiful. But this time, Babarn was not looking at Scarlet, but at the silver halberd in the girl's hand. He looked at it with fascination as if he was possessed. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.